Uncovering a killer's mistake can lead detectives to unexpected places. Those who take the lives of others may work hard to remain masked, camouflaged. It's a classic Sunday night in England, and a local arrives for a drink.
He went to a local pub where he sat and ordered a ploughman's, had a chat with the landlady, and drank an orange juice and lemonade.
Shortly after, the man popped his coat on, went to the bathroom.
And he dried his hands on a paper towel, which he put in the bin. The biggest mistake Paul Hutchinson made was that he didn't have a crystal ball. He couldn't anticipate the advances in forensic science that would bring about his undoing.
An hour or so earlier, Colette Aram failed to turn up as expected at her boyfriend's house in a nearby village. The family reported her missing.
Colette was such a genuinely beautiful person that she wouldn't let anybody worry about her.
The paper towel and the missing girl became part of a 22-year murder mystery. Every investigation is like a jigsaw, each piece offering new evidence as a picture of a suspect emerges. But which one will reveal the killer's mistake?
Why Colette? She's beautiful, Colette. Why her?
Keyworth, Nottinghamshire, in the English Midlands, a village which has grown slowly to become a small town, safe, dependable.
If you like village life, then Keyworth was an ideal place to live. Picturesque, low crime rate, just a lovely, rural, idyllic place to be.
Keyworth's a lovely village. It was where I grew up. It's a beautiful village, and in the 80s when we were growing up, it was one of the safest places. You just went everywhere and did your own thing, and a lot of people know each other, friendly, and just a lovely place to grow up.
Karen Willis, like so many 16-year-olds in 1983, spent Sunday glued to the radio. What would be top of the pops that week?
It was a normal Sunday evening, and we had listened to the top 30.
After finding out it was Culture Club and Karma Chameleon, she planned on a date with her boyfriend and set off on foot to his house.
Walking everywhere was never an issue. You would go anywhere and everywhere by foot and felt comfortable doing so.
But that night would be different.
I did my usual, say goodbye to Mum, and off I trotted to the local pub, if you like, in the corner to meet my boyfriend. And as I was walking, there was an incident that gave me a little bit of a concern. There was a car that had passed by me, and I didn't recognise, and it was really, really, slightly made me feel anxious, this car, because it sort of like beat me, but I didn't know who it was.
It was an unsettling moment for the young woman, and it wasn't over.
So carried on walking down the road, and then a little bit further down the road, I was again, the same car, beeped again. Which made me then think, who are you? It made me slightly anxious, and I continued down the road as fast as I could because I could see a couple walking together. So I tried to catch up with them.
Who was it? what had just happened. A friend, perhaps, who was saying hello? That would be typical of Keyworth. Karen Willis did catch up with the couple ahead of her, eventually got home safe. Later, she planned on calling her best friend, Colette Aram. They'd met at school.
As Colette was growing up, she liked lots of different things. She liked riding, what have you. But we just had fun. There was no, we were just innocent young children that were lucky enough to grow up in a lovely area and lucky enough to have wonderful parents. And we were just happy children.
And Colette was an easy choice for best friend.
Colette was a model daughter. She was studious at school. She listened to her parents. They couldn't have wished for a more beautiful girl.
She was very considerate and kind and gentle and soft and caring.
The girls had the same ambition for when they left school.
We were both starting to do hairdressing, and Colette and I were so excited because we were going to go to college together. She was working in one salon and I was going to work in the other.
Feeling confident about their futures, Karen and Colette felt set for life. First job, great place to live, and no reason to be worried about a neighbour called Paul Hutchinson.
Paul Hutchinson seemed like a completely normal man next door. He was married, he had children, he had a normal job. There was nothing that made him stand out as abnormal or out of the ordinary.
Except they should have been worried. Appearances, even in Middle England and places like Keyworth, can be deceptive.
They don't come much worse than Paul Hutchinson. As a committed sexual deviant,
in his spare time, he liked to hide out in sheds, watching young girls riding horses while touching himself.
This man certainly had sexual problems. He had sexual paraphilia.
Sexual paraphilia, defined as intense sexual arousal to atypical objects and fantasies, also known as sexual fetishism.
he'd hide away in stables and in woods. He got off by watching young girls.
In Hutchinson's case, he certainly had a leaning towards very young girls. He liked to spy on them, he liked to look at them, and was maybe fantasising about having sex with them.
The farms and fields outside the village gave Hutchinson plenty of opportunity to pursue his perverse pastime, all the while remaining unsuspected.
He had no previous criminal convictions.
A more vile kind of man I struggle to think of.
To locals, Paul Hutchinson was a 24-year-old who said he graduated in psychology before training as an electrician and settling early into family life.
Sometimes people like Hutchinson make a very good job of hiding their sexual fantasies. There will always be some people who will recognise perhaps the strange behaviours. And sometimes within families, it depends how much questioning there is. He might have been able to live quite a private life in his own home.
Those living near him, as the young married man whose wife had recently had a baby, saw him as a textbook family man. They were completely oblivious to the danger in their midst, a chameleon blending in behind the facade of Keyworth life, respected, unsuspected of anything untoward.
Certain criminals are what they are. They steal, they rob, they burgle. So very much what you see is what you get.
Not Paul Hutchinson.
He wasn't just an ordinary man living an ordinary life. He was somebody who was split, knew that he needed to protect one life to maintain the other life.
But deep down, in the dark recesses, he lives a very, very different life, unbeknown to everybody, and that's a very dangerous thing.
It was the 30th of October 1983 when Karen Willis had been beeped at by a motorist. Earlier, Paul Hutchinson was doing what Paul Hutchinson did, spying on young girls riding. Colette Aram had been at the stables. When home, she planned a night out.
Colette had gone to meet her boyfriend, so she was going, as we all did, walking to see her boyfriend. He was going to meet her up Nicker Hill. Again, a beautiful place in Geworth where you wouldn't think anything of walking.
It was still a mystery to Karen, who had beeped at her earlier. As detectives later tried to uncover a killer's mistake, they would want an answer to that mystery. At 7 o'clock, a few streets away from Karen, Colette headed out. Around 8 o'clock on October 30th, people living on this estate heard the screams of a woman.
Locals heard a woman screaming. They also heard a car screeching off.
The sound came and went. A brief moment of concern, but explained away perhaps as young people fooling around. Earlier that same day, unbeknownst to anyone, Paul Hutchinson had been indulging himself, ogling girls at the stables. Jane Monckton-Smith helps police forces profile people like Hutchinson.
They behave in a very ritualistic way, so they have what you might call a fantasy in their head, which they relive, and that's how they get their kicks. Clearly, with somebody like Hutchinson, he's got a very specific ritual in mind, so he'll be looking for a certain type of victim, and he was looking for a young girl.
A young girl like Colette Aram, who was on her way to visit her boyfriend.
Colette didn't arrive at her boyfriend's, and soon afterwards the alarm went up. Colette's missing. Something's very, very wrong. It was very out of character for Colette to go missing. Some children do, and they do that a lot, but not Colette. This was completely out of character.
She would have phoned her mum to say, by the way, I've just popped into Karen's, or I've just popped in, wherever she was going, she would have said. So mum wouldn't worry, because she was such a kind, considerate person. And that's why we knew so quickly that Colette was missing straight away, because she didn't arrive, and she would have made the phone call.
Sometime that night, Colette's family called the police.
As a detective, you dread hearing those words, a child has gone missing. Detectives are parents themselves, but they have to suppress all the natural concerns that they might have because they've got a job to do. We've got to find this child.
As police arrive at the scene, family and friends convey a picture of Colette that makes it clear she isn't the kind of girl who just disappears. She must be in trouble.
Everybody else that was around, had gone looking for her and was searching to find where she'd suddenly disappeared to, because nothing made sense.
But this is serious. This is worrying. We've got to find this girl. The search parameters were set. Start at her home, follow the route to her boyfriend's, fan it out as much as you possibly can, depending on how many resources you've got available.
Turmoil, horrendous.
While police searched, Karen Willis becomes convinced that the strange car she encountered earlier that evening could give a clue to Colette's whereabouts.
The police wanted to know a little bit more about it, but unfortunately that really, really hurts and still does. The fact that I couldn't give them anything more than the fact that this car had passed me and made me feel anxious.
The next day, the community sprung into action.
Everybody went out looking for Colette, everybody that knew was searching for her. Her brother, her mum, her dad, aunties, uncle, everybody was there trying to find where's Colette, because clearly that wouldn't have happened. She would have let us know.
The following day, about 1.5 miles from the route that she'd followed, Colette's body was found. She had been raped, strangled, and her body had been left in a sexually provocative pose. Colette's brother had to suffer the horror of finding his own sister dead.
To this day, I have no idea how he lives and copes with what he saw. Trauma never goes away. The family every day live with that trauma, and it's never going to go away. You know, you can say time makes a difference, but it doesn't. It's so traumatic what happened. I personally had to break away from any of the information about what had happened to Colette that evening, and that was how I protected myself. I felt guilty that it was Colette. I didn't want, obviously, it to be me, but I had so much guilt that, why Colette? She's, she's beautiful Colette. Why her? Why anybody? But, yeah.
As police searched for clues and the perpetrator, village life in Keyworth, a previously serene and safe space, was turned on its head.
Keyworth changed that day. It became a different village. It became a village where nobody trusted one another. Everybody wanted to know where everybody was, and we weren't allowed to walk the street by myself, and I didn't want to. We were too frightened. And probably to this day, obviously the children now are growing up, but even as parents, I always make sure I take my children everywhere, and I know that my parents did the same from that day forth.
Police were on the hunt for a killer's mistake. Quickly and correctly, they assessed the sequence of events.
Colette was abducted from a country lane. She was bundled into a car. She was strangled and she was raped, and then her body was dumped in a field.
When Colette's parents bid her farewell that evening, they wouldn't have dreamt for a moment that such an appalling thing was going to happen to her.
Detectives built a case from the evidence up, and what they quickly learned was that a motorist had pestered a young woman in Keyworth, and hours later, another young woman had been snatched, or perhaps accepted a ride. That theory was quickly ruled out.
Colette would never have gone into a car. Not in a million years would Colette have. She would have had to have been forcefully. Somebody maybe asked her directions. I don't know how that happened, but clearly she wouldn't have, gone into that car without a forceful situation.
Unmasking Paul Hutchinson would not be easy. No one suspected the quiet family man. His penchant for perversions were widely unknown, and he'd never escalated to attacking a girl. On the evening of Colette's murder, he behaved as usually as he could.
Only about 20 minutes or so after the murder, Paul Hutchinson went to a pub.
Where he sat and ordered a ploughman's, had a chat with the landlady and drank an orange juice and lemonade.
The barmaid that served him was alarmed by his demeanour. He seemed a bit strange. She really thought something was wrong. Hutchinson used the toilet, and he dried his hands on a paper towel which he put in the bin.
The landlady of the generous Britain pub where Hutchinson went that night had noticed something suspicious about the orange and lemonade drinking man, and acted after the news of the teenager's murder became public.
The landlady called police saying, "There was this guy in here and I did notice some blood on his hands."
They went to the pub,
And they retrieved some items, including a paper towel.
but one very, very astute detective seized the paper towel that Hutchinson had used.
Which had traces of blood, and it turned out semen on it.
Now, back in the 80s, there was no DNA analysis of exhibits. That science just didn't exist. Basically, it was fingerprints and very little else.
And even in the late 80s, once fingerprinting had been invented, you needed large amounts of biological specimens to actually be able to generate a DNA profile.
That detective had the wherewithal to seize that exhibit, the significance of which wouldn't be realised for over a quarter of a century.
How had Paul Hutchinson, the pervert who preyed on horse-riding girls, escalated to murder and then had the audacity to calmly go into a pub?
With sexual killers, the act that they get involved in, whereas we look at it as something that would create an emotional kind of explosion for us, we'd feel dreadful afterwards. What they actually feel afterwards is relief. So they are, after that, feeling relieved and will present as probably calmer than they had done in the run-up to that homicide. So he could have gone to the pub and actually, with that feeling of relief, been able to stand there and have a drink and chat to the landlady without looking as if he'd done something absolutely dreadful.
The day after the discovery of Colette's body in a field near Keyworth, Paul Hutchinson told his wife that he had a job which would take him away from Keyworth for a little while. Soon he would show a chilling level of confidence that he'd got away with murder. Colette Aram had been murdered and police did not have a suspect. They could not know that her killer had returned to Keyworth from where he had conveniently left on the pretense of working away.
Hutchinson was also a cocky character, so I think it's about 5 weeks after the murder was committed, he actually went back to the village and had a look around, saw what the police were doing.
This was a really serious crime, and he would have known that there would have been a lot of police activity. He'd have been quite concerned that he might have left some evidence behind. After the initial period of having committed that crime, he'll start thinking about the repercussions of that. And sometimes going back to the scene, people go back for different reasons.
I'm sure Hutchinson was enjoying some kind of weird and perverted adrenaline rush not long after the murder. He was probably trying to constrain himself from telling somebody about what he'd done. This, for him, was the pinnacle of his very sad life.
If Hutchinson was enjoying the fact that he, a killer, could parade in front of police hunting for a killer, he was about to take his cockiness one stage further.
Hutchinson decided that he'd taunt the police, so he wrote them a letter saying words to the effect that "you can't catch me." But he was making mistakes that unfortunately wouldn't be discovered for a long, long time.
Despite what we see represented in lots of television programmes, it's very unusual for somebody who's committed a murder like this to then taunt the police and send letters. Not only is it an arrogant thing to do, it's an incredibly stupid thing to do because it gives the police another line of potential forensic evidence. We can't know exactly why he wrote that letter, but it's almost as if he wanted some recognition for what he'd done. He might have seen it almost as an achievement not to have been caught, and he was a kind of a narcissistic person. He liked to big himself up. He liked to tell people that he was a psychology graduate. He liked people to recognise how clever he was, and that might have been the purpose in sending that letter.
Clever enough to know that what evidence he was giving to the police was worthless. Hutchinson had a clean record.
Police had this letter. At that time, they would have been able to do a few tests on it. They could do some handwriting analysis, but you need a suspect to compare the handwriting to. Similarly, they might have been able to recover fingerprints from the letter, but you need a fingerprint that matches. So you need Hutchinson's fingerprints to be in a fingerprint database.
Not only did police not suspect the local electrician, his own family and friends were equally in the dark. Hutchinson was good at keeping secrets. He went on with life as normal.
Depending on his kind of personality profile, depending if he was somewhere on the spectrum of psychopathy, very often those people do become very good liars because they become very manipulative. And if you tell a really big lie that you can't imagine anyone would lie about, that almost, is your cover. But he may have been somebody who routinely lied anyway. He certainly presents as that kind of person, so was very used to it.
The masquerade of Hutchinson the young family man continued as the hunt for the killer was scaled down. How had he got away with it? The police had blood on a paper towel, possibly left by a suspect, fingerprints on the letter that he had sent, coldly telling the police they would never catch him. But weeks turned into months, then years, and still no arrest for the murder of Colette. He had made mistakes, but technology advances would be needed to uncover them.
If the same crime happened today, one of the obvious first things police would have been able to do was retrieve DNA from Colette's body, from underneath her fingernails. They'd be able to look at the fibres on her body. They'd be able to maybe look at DNA found on her clothes. Those tools just didn't exist back in 1983.
No CCTV. No automatic number plate recognition cameras. No mobile phones and all the evidence that they can give. And forensic science was really in its infancy. If you got a fingerprint, you were a very lucky detective.
DNA fingerprinting was invented in the mid-80s and started being used towards the end of the 80s, and even then you needed a large amount of biological material. Today, you can just run a swab over a door handle, pick up a couple of cells and generate a DNA profile from those cells.
The murder of Colette Aram was to be the first case to appear on a British TV programme called Crime Watch. Colette's mother made an appeal.
As a mum, she went on Crime Watch, did so many, everything she could possibly do as a mum to get him where he needed to be, behind bars.
Crime Watch was new. It was something different. It gave the police a tool that they'd never had before.
Keyworth had a population of around 4,000. The new information in many ways got in the way. Every single man in the community, but for one, was innocent. But they were all suddenly worried about a visit from the police.
There were around 1,500 people that might have been potential suspects. There were hundreds of other witnesses to be interviewed. And the cops really didn't have the tools then that they do today. So it was old school. Old school methods, old school tactics.
Investigations and interviews that followed the Crime Watch appeal didn't lead to any arrests, but it did make Paul Hutchinson, the killer still living in Keyworth, feel that the net was tightening.
Lots of people were getting questioned and interviewed. Hutchinson was alarmed by this, so he concocted a story which he told to his family that he'd got cancer and that he had to go away for treatment. This story was so elaborate that he actually pulled tufts of his own hair out to convince people that those were the effects of the cancer treatment.
Hutchinson's cynical portrayal of himself as a cancer victim meant that he could leave his family and the area.
By slipping away like that, he managed to evade police questioning.
If officers going door to door, following up leads from the TV programme, called at his house, there was a legitimate reason for him to be away. It's a classic diversionary tactic.
Claiming that he had lung cancer is not only a big lie, it's a very specific kind of a lie. And sometimes when people want to avoid being questioned or challenged about something, they will feign some kind of illness so that people will feel guilty about questioning them. So if he's telling his family that he's ill, that's a very specific lie. They're all going to be sympathising with him. He's going to get away with behaviours that he perhaps wouldn't have got away with before. So it's an incredibly good lie to tell.
Keyworth again returned to some sort of normality. Karen's friends and family struggled to rebuild their lives. Karen decided to devote herself to her chosen career. It was a mark of honour for her friend.
Everything I did, I was determined to do it well. I mean, it was like college. We'd made so many plans to go together. I worked so hard in college to make sure I did really well, but, not just for me, for Colette, And yeah, it was really difficult because I had to do the job she was doing in that salon. There's no question, that's what I had to do.
As the years passed, the investigation continued to draw blanks, and eventually Paul Hutchinson returned to the area and picked up his life. He was a killer, hiding in plain sight.
As the initial heat from the inquiry died down, Hutchinson sort of reintegrated himself into society.
He kind of went off radar for a bit, and he started a new life.
His first marriage broke down, so he married again.
He had more children, including a son called Jean-Paul.
He worked as an electrician, a salesman. He even served as a school governor.
Despite the witness evidence, forensics and tip-offs from the general public, Paul Hutchinson lived the standard Keyworth life for a man with children, going to work, coming home, accepted by those around him. But time was passing, science was improving. His mistakes would one day catch up with him.
Fast forward 20 years, police try again. So they have another look at the evidence and they swab that letter that was sent to them, taunting them. They have a look at Colette's clothes and retrieve DNA from her clothing. They also have another look at that paper towel that was found in the pub. From these three sources, they're able to put together a DNA profile of the possible killer. They still have a problem though. They may have a DNA profile of the killer, but they still need to match it to somebody.
What mistakes had Hutchinson made? Would he ever be uncovered as the killer? In Britain, a statute of limitations means that some crimes are left unsolved. Burglary, theft, vandalism, the list goes on. As the years pass, the cases are dropped. There's no statute of limitation on murder. The crime remains on the books forever or until solved. Paul Hutchinson may or may not have known that as he went about his normal life in Keyworth.
By the time 2008 came round, forensic science had leapt forward enormously. Some of the exhibits from Colette's case had been examined and DNA profiles had been obtained. Every person that was arrested was now being swabbed as a matter of routine. One such person got arrested for a driving offence, taken to the police station and was swabbed.
That young man was called John Paul Hutchinson. A killer's mistake was about to be revealed.
His days were numbered.
The turning point in this case comes when Hutchinson's son, Jean-Paul, is pulled over for a speeding offence and arrested. A DNA profile is taken, and then they generate this partial hit.
There were such advances in forensic sample testing and especially DNA evidence, which just wasn't around when he committed that offence. And things have moved forward so much that you don't even need to be yourself on the database now for the police to get a match. And increasingly we're seeing that where people who've committed offences 20, 30 years ago are now getting that knock on the door, which a lot of them must be dreading. So he couldn't possibly have predicted that things would advance in the way that they have. So he was just very unlucky that he managed to keep himself off the DNA database so that that match wasn't made, but he could not control any of his relatives getting onto the database.
Like the man arrested on a driving offence in Keyworth.
An analysis of his DNA profile showed a lot of similarities with the DNA profile that they'd got from the exhibits around Colette's murder. The dots were beginning to get joined up.
Jean-Paul's DNA matches the crime scene DNA profile, not entirely, but enough that that makes them think, maybe this person is related to the killer.
There was a match then to Colette's murder, and it was only a matter of time before he got the knock on the door.
Was the family man about to discover that his own son inadvertently would create his father's downfall? The DNA profile was close enough for police to suspect that a family member of the young John Paul Hutchinson was linked to Colette's murder. It couldn't be John Paul, he was too young.
Once you've identified that somebody may be a relative of the person who committed the crime, there are other tests, other DNA tests you can do. One of them is Y chromosome testing. So usually when you generate a DNA profile, you're looking at little markers across all of the chromosomes. In this type of test, you're looking just at the Y chromosome. The Y chromosome is what males carry. So females have two X chromosomes. Males have an X chromosome and a Y chromosome. And that Y chromosome is important because a copy of it is passed down the male line. So Paul Hutchinson's brothers will carry the same Y chromosome. They inherited it from their father. But Hutchinson and his brothers will also be passing that same Y chromosome down to their sons. So when Jean-Paul's Y chromosome is tested, they can then look at other male relatives and get a stronger idea of whether this person really is related or not.
The DNA profile police had from John Paul was a familial match to that found on the paper towel carelessly discarded by a man at the Generous Britain pub in 1983. It matched the DNA found on Colette's clothes too. But his father Paul had a reason for that. It wasn't his DNA. He was going to try and lie his way out of it.
The police arrested Hutchinson and he spun a yarn. He said the DNA profile that they'd got actually belonged to his brother who was dead, so he was trying to put the blame on him.
What he doesn't realise is the police have his dead brother's DNA and it's not a match.
So that blew a hole in Hutchinson's story. And there was a fingerprint on the letter that Hutchinson wrote to the police all those years ago. So now, the DNA from Colette's clothes, the DNA from the paper towel in the pub, the fingerprint on the letter, the case against Hutchinson was looking compelling.
Once you've used familial DNA testing to identify Paul Hutchinson as the suspect, you then need to do a full DNA profile because familial searching isn't enough to say with certainty this person matches a crime scene profile. So you swab Paul Hutchinson's DNA and you generate a DNA profile and you compare that to the profiles from the paper towel and from Colette's clothing and so on, and you see that they match.
Time was up for the killer of Colette Aram. It was Paul Hutchinson who'd skulked in the stables, a peeping Tom pervert who'd spied on young girls near Keyworth. It was almost certainly Paul Hutchinson who'd beeped at Karen Willis, who had snatched Colette Aram as she walked to see her boyfriend, who had strangled, raped her, murdered her, and then dumped her body in fields. It was Paul Hutchinson who'd gone to the Generous Britain pub, casually ordered an orange and lemonade, washed away blood from his hands before drying them on a paper towel. It was Paul Hutchinson, who'd lived the lie of being a family man, stand-up citizen, school governor and electrician living in a neat house on a neat row in a neat street of Keyworth.
26 years after the crime, Paul Hutchinson was sentenced to life imprisonment.
But that is not the end of the story of the killer who made a mistake. Hutchinson got hold of enough tablets to take an overdose.
Annoyingly, he only served a few months of that sentence. He took his own life. I always get extremely irritated by murderers who are allowed to take their own lives in prison. Hutchinson evaded justice while he was alive. He has now been able to evade justice through his death.
When he went to prison, he got a life sentence, and he probably didn't see much of a life for himself in there. Everything that he'd known, all of the family network, the stability that he had gone. It's very sad for the family because they don't feel that they got justice. But in the end, he was never going to give them justice anyway. And this was his final act of, I'm going to deal with this, I'm going to win, I'm going to have the final say.
As criminologists reflect on the murder of Colette Aram and the evasion from justice for decades of Paul Hutchinson, they can now see why he was destined to be captured.
Hutchinson actually made quite a lot of mistakes, any of which could have ended with his arrest. He was just lucky that they didn't, really. Sending those letters, for example, was a big mistake. And certainly when he was arrested, having sent those letters, that wouldn't have helped with his sentencing because it shows no remorse. He couldn't have known about the DNA advances, but even so, going into that pub, talking to the landlady so close to the murder scene, going into that pub with blood on his hands, leaving behind a tissue which had Colette's DNA on it and his DNA on it, that was a big mistake.
Hutchinson's biggest mistake is that he left actually lots of evidence lying about. At the time, the technology didn't exist to do anything with that evidence, but as time goes by, technology develops, and then they could catch him. The other great irony here is that Hutchinson went away, kind of disappeared, didn't do anything else that we know of, but then his son gets pulled over for a speeding conviction, and then because of that, because of something his son does wrong, police are able to look back and find him.
The biggest mistake Paul Hutchinson made was that he didn't have a crystal ball. He couldn't anticipate the advances in forensic science that would bring about his undoing. He left DNA at the scene, he left DNA on that paper towel at the pub, and of course there was a fingerprint on the letter.
Those who loved Colette Aram finally saw justice done for the teenager who had high hopes and a life ahead of her. But that will never bring her back.
Beautiful, quiet, kind and giggly. Her giggle, I'll never forget that giggle. It's still, her giggle is the one thing that has never ever, it's so clear in my mind, her giggle, because it was slightly different, but it made you smile.
In an idyllic place, a mother disappears from the family home.
Our kids had come home from school, she wasn't there. That was unexpected.
The door was left open. She was meant to be collecting her child from school. She didn't turn up.
Police were called to the address. Later that evening, Nat, the father, the husband, had been contacted. He was staying elsewhere at the time. Thereafter, the investigation into her as a missing person began because it was totally out of character.
Arlene Fraser, a family woman, had simply vanished.
Nobody could explain where Arlene was.
Weeks earlier, she'd been attacked. Was there a link?
Arlene was just an ordinary mum. Why would someone attempt to murder her a month before and then she goes missing?
In a case which frustrated detectives, A specialist lip reader used by Britain's security services, her identity protected, was drafted in to help uncover the truth.
And at another point, he actually mimed drawing his wrist when he was talking about cutting up the bones.
What had happened to Arlene Fraser? Detectives fear she's been abducted, murdered. And if she has, how will they solve the mystery? Every investigation is like a jigsaw, each piece offering new evidence as a picture of a suspect emerges. But which one will reveal the killer's mistake? "200 miles from Elgin in the northeast of Scotland on a blustery April evening, Carol Gillies is at home near Glasgow. Her life is about to change.
It all started with a knock on the door. There was a policeman standing there from Strathclyde Police, and he'd said, your sister's been reported missing. Right away, I felt that was it. You know, Arlene wouldn't go missing. She had 2 children that she loved.
Nothing added up. At her home in Smith Street, Elgin, the minutiae of Arlene Fraser's life, including vital medication, were discarded.
If she'd really disappeared and run away, she would have packed the medicine she needed for her Crohn's disease. She would have packed her spectacles. She wouldn't have left her door open. She would have made arrangements, you think, as a loving mother, for her child to be picked up from school. There were all these things that were very suspicious.
A 14-year riddle of the mother who had disappeared had begun. What followed saw a cat-and-mouse game between killer and investigator. Would a murderer's mistake be uncovered in a story which begins with an inexplicable scene?
It was as if she had just been spirited away. Some of her clothing was in the bathroom, just folded and ready to be presumably worn. It looked like she had been in the middle of some housework.
The vacuum cleaner is plugged in as if she's just kind of stopped using it midway through cleaning.
Arlene was a creature of habit. She had a set routine, and she went missing on a Tuesday morning. Now, a Tuesday morning was pretty much the only period of time that she would have been at home alone, or known to be home alone by those who knew her. She went to college. She had the kids, obviously, in the evenings and the weekends. So the period of time that she would have had peace at home was really very much only on a Tuesday morning. And then she always met a friend for lunch in the town.
From looking at all Arlene's, her life, and the way she lived her life, I mean, she'd been a mother for 10 years. She was going back to college. She was doing that on a Tuesday. She was trying to build up her own wee life. The kids were now both at school.
There was a strangeness around the house, but there was no upset. There was no signs of violence. There was nothing knocked over. There was certainly no crime scene. It just looked like the house had emptied.
On the day itself, April 28th, police had little option but to ask for all of the relevant forces to be on the lookout and then alert the public of Arlene's disappearance. Perhaps she would return.
The first thing you might consider is that they've just run away. Maybe they've run away with someone else. Maybe they've just run away by themselves. They just want to start a new life.
24 hours went by. Still no sign of Arlene.
The next day, it was becoming a little bit more sinister in the sense that there was just no obvious explanation why Arlene hadn't come home.
The practicalities of a mother who suddenly vanishes from a family home present an immediate problem for those called in to help, like what to do with 2 school-aged children.
We collected the kids, Jamie and Natalie, and obviously they needed night clothes, the school uniform, etc. They're both standing in the doorway with 2 plastic bags. They just looked so bewildered and so lost as was happening, bearing in mind Natalie was 5 and Jamie was 10, you know. For me, you know, that just rubber stamped it that this was not Arlene's doing. There was no way Arlene would do this to her children, absolutely no way.
She loved her 2 children, and there's no way she would have left the children. She was going to run away. She would have taken the children with her. So I knew right away that Arlene was dead.
Dead. Arlene's father feared she was dead within a day of her disappearance. When evaluating the case, it's important to understand why there was such disbelief that Arlene would simply run away. It would have meant leaving a 10 and 5-year-old in an empty house because the children's father was not living in the family home. Nat Fraser, Arlene's husband, was someone investigating Detective Alan Smith, based in Glasgow, knew all about from his days as a local policeman in Elgin. Understanding Nat Fraser becomes vital to uncovering a killer's mistake.
My first conversation with Nat Fraser, the husband, was probably a matter of days after I arrived up in Elgin. I'd known Nat from a previous life. He was a local businessman. He was involved in the delivery of fruit and veg to local businesses. He was a popular individual in Elgin. He played in a local band, a music band at weekends. So he was a popular individual in the town.
Nat Fraser was an incredibly manipulative man who could make friends quite easily. He set up a business, it was very successful, and none of these things go against his general personality. He wasn't one of those people who was a loner, who kept himself away from people. He very much the opposite. He was out there, he was in control, he was the boss, he was the master of what was going on.
But he was no longer master in his own home. Arlene had seen a solicitor. She wanted a divorce. Nat had beaten her. Charged with attempted murder, later downgraded to assault, he was living out of the town on bail.
Nat Fraser had a very definite history that would have raised him as a potential risk to his wife. Some of the things that were reported about him and his behaviours would even, I think, have made him a high risk to his wife. That assault was a very, very serious one. He had put his hands around her throat and threatened her life.
The police begin to build up this picture of an unhappy relationship, one which she was trying to escape, and a potentially violent partner.
But when his wife disappeared, Nat had his sympathisers. He was a popular man. When locals and the police asked about Arlene, Nat would answer, revealing how tormented he was.
There's 2 sides to Nat Fraser. There's the public Nat Fraser, the hail fellow well met, the popular van delivery guy. Everybody in the town thinks he's a cheeky chappy, always cracking a joke, flirting with the ladies. That's one side of Nat Fraser. The other side that we began to unearth as we looked very much more closely into him as an individual is that there was very much a dark side to the private Nat Fraser. And what we saw there was quite alarming. He clearly had a history of domestic abuse. Arlene had been subjected to domestic abuse on many occasions. He was a controlling individual.
He didn't necessarily have any real loving or emotional investment in Arlene herself. And there was strong evidence of controlling and coercive behaviours and violence.
Knowing all of this, why was Nat Fraser not immediately a significant person of interest to the police?
Irrespective of our hunch, you've got to follow the evidence. And the evidence that we had was very, very thin. We didn't have a crime scene. We didn't have any witnesses. We didn't have any forensic evidence. We didn't have any CCTV that helped us. We didn't have any confessions. So we didn't have a crime. So our first challenge as an investigation was, is Arlene alive? Or has she gone missing?
There was something else which deflected suspicion from Nat Fraser. He had an alibi. He was known to be out of town delivering fruit and veg the day that Arlene went missing.
He was accompanied by a van delivery boy. His vehicle was seen on CCTV at a particular location on that particular day. He was on a telephone call to a lady who he'd previously had a relationship with but hadn't phoned in years, and ironically never phoned again. So he made sure that he was marking his scent that morning.
Detectives were in constant dialogue with Nat Fraser, but if something sinister had happened to Arlene, he had made no mistake to put him in the frame.
She had gone missing, and there was nothing to say to the contrary. He was not a suspect for months and months and months because there was no evidence.
Why had a doting mother walked out on her children? Was husband Nat involved in her disappearance? Where was Arlene Fraser? Detectives with little to go on in the hunt for Arlene Fraser simply kept a watching brief on her husband Nat. His demeanour did not compute with what they knew had been going on behind closed doors on Smith Street.
Nat's behaviours were odd around the time that she was reported missing. Now, on the evening that she was reported missing, he was staying with a friend and he had received a phone call that Arlene had gone missing. Now, in the context at that time that they were a couple going through a divorce and there was no love lost there between them, bizarrely he went straight into the Telgin where she lived, and within no time at all that evening he was checking the hospital. He was showing all signs of distress and concern, which was completely out of character.
After only a few days, he seems kind of very blasé about the whole thing, and he goes from being the extremely concerned partner to police actually having to contact him to give updates on the case. A few weeks later, he's making jokes to friends about, oh, the kids will get used to her being away and so on. That's not the behaviour of somebody who's genuinely worried about their partner and the fact that they've been missing for several weeks now.
The media locally and nationally began to speculate, but not about Nat Fraser. Coverage focused on the mother who'd abandoned her children.
There was a lot of bad press about Arlene, which was, was hard to read. There was talks of her being on drugs, which was just ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous, about having boyfriends, things like that.
Where were the stories coming from? None other than Nat Fraser.
And of course, naturally, those who know Arlene, that would make no sense. So he introduced some elements to create an impression that she was involved in drugs, that she was promiscuous, that she was involved in other relationships. He blackened her character.
I think these things come with the territory, but at the time you don't realise that. You just have to, if you can't stand the heat, get out of the kitchen sort of thing. So we just tried our best to kind of rise above it.
But undoubtedly this was part of Nat's plan to create an impression, plant a seed that Arlene was into amphetamine, into drugs, which was never the case because we were able physically to get samples of Arlene's hair from a hairbrush post-disappearance. And that evidence scientifically told us that Arlene was not involved in drug abuse. Similarly, the relationships that he suggested and others close to Nat suggested she was involved in never came to anything.
Detectives wondered why Nat Fraser would start these stories. As the months passed, Nat pushed a plausible story. Arlene had run away. It became vital to him that the picture he painted of Arlene was seen to be true amongst the community, including the police. Arlene's betrayal of her family was a story which Nat repeated to anyone who would listen.
They believed, through fantastic propaganda by Nat Fraser and his close friends, that this woman had up sticks, abandoned her kids, disappeared, leaving him and the kids with a difficult situation. So she was being painted as a pariah.
Fraser embellished the story as the anniversary of her disappearance neared. Arlene had funded her new life with a stash of Nat's cash taken from his house. But Arlene's father, Nat's father-in-law, a quiet man, told a different story.
I knew that Arlene hadn't run away, despite what Nat Fraser was saying. I just knew because she would have phoned me on the Tuesday, so I suspected right away that she had possibly been killed.
And he had an idea of his own as to who was responsible.
They always blame the husband in murder cases, so possibly Mr. Fraser would be a prime suspect. Although I think there might have been one or two others up there. But he was a suspect.
And I think the police knew that, they were looking at a murder investigation.
By 1999, detectives were convinced that Arlene had indeed been the victim of a violent crime and was dead. But if so, no killer had revealed a mistake. They set about proving their suspicions in stages. First, that Arlene was not alive.
The proof of death, which is what we were doing, the proof of death in relation to Arlene is about closing doors of life possibilities. So no activity on her bank or any finances for X period of time. No apparent interaction with pharmaceutical outlets for medication that she needed in the UK, not just locally, in the UK. Similarly with her contact lenses, her renewable contact lenses. No activity in that regard. Telephony, nothing that would suggest contact with friends, family. All of these elements had to be proved in a negative sense to be able to then say, it looks very much like there's just no evidence that this woman is alive.
Nat Fraser went about his life, running his fruit and veg business around the town, in and out of the family home on Smith Street.
He maintained an impression that he thought she had gone on holiday. And I remember saying to Nat, this is some length of holiday that Arlene's gone on. And even then, he tried to know that it was credible. She's gone off to Spain. And despite trying to reason with Nat that this is so out of character, how can you really believe this of Arlene? It just seemed illogical, incredible. But he couldn't but maintain that position, because to give an inch would be a weakness in the sense of it would have given ground back towards where he didn't want to go.
Arlene's father and sister, meanwhile, were finding it hard to cope.
It was really difficult because one minute you're living quite a normal life, you're just every day, you're going to work, you've got 2 children, you're doing your housework, etc. And then all of a sudden you've stepped into this really almost dark life, when you're talking, the word murder, you're talking about that's horrible.
18 months after Arlene's disappearance, some in the police had concluded there'd been foul play. And privately, some acknowledged that they had a suspect, the same man that the family believed responsible, the man who was about to face charges for the attack on Arlene 5 weeks before she went missing, Nat Fraser. There seemed to be no other theories possible.
The question has to be, who would gain the most from Arlene's disappearance? Now, in terms of motivation, Nat had a huge amount of motivation to get rid of Arlene.
And statistically speaking, when a woman is murdered, in about half of cases, it's a partner or ex-partner who turns out to be to blame. So Nat Fraser is going to be an obvious suspect.
The number one motivation was that he was already awaiting criminal trial for her attempted murder just weeks before she disappeared. So freedom, if she wasn't there to give evidence, was obvious. The second thing is, we knew that she had been in talks with her solicitor around about a divorce settlement, a 6-figure divorce settlement, which was going to hugely damage him financially. Motivation number 2 With Arlene out of the equation, he's not going to lose his money. If Arlene was no longer there, he would get back into the family home, he would control that, he would get back with the kids and control that. All of his finances, he would be back in control. So from a perspective of motivation, there was no shortage of motivation.
Whilst there were still plenty of people in Elgin who supported the popular Nat Fraser, time was not on his side. By the second anniversary of Arlene's disappearance, there seemed no sensible reason to support the claim that she had abandoned her children and left home.
It was only the passage of time, weeks, months, years with some individuals, before they began to reflect on the likelihood of this as being sensible. You know, birthdays had passed, Christmases had passed. The kids, she was a devoted mother. The one thing that we knew was that she was a devoted mother. And yet, birthdays passed, Christmases passed. It was absolutely illogical.
I mean, obviously, the police were getting information from all angles about Arlene. They would talk to her friends, they would talk to Nat Fraser, and most importantly, they talked to the people that actually, really, really know her.
But Nat had an impregnable alibi, and there was no body to confirm Arlene was dead. Neither Arlene nor her remains had been found. She might still be alive. So what charge could detectives possibly bring? If she had been murdered, they needed the killer to reveal a mistake. Nat Fraser, a suspect as time passed for something, but for what? A turning point in the case came when a key piece of evidence was uncovered. An Elgin mechanic revealed that he'd sold a vehicle to a friend of Nat Fraser.
The case went very quiet, and then there was talk of a car being used, a beige Fiesta.
We uncovered a significant break for the first time in relation to a vehicle.
And police were very excited about this, and I think it is relevant to the inquiry.
And the Ford Fiesta had been purchased the night before Arlene had gone missing, the 27th of April, by a very close associate of Nat Fraser, in circumstances that could only be described as very covert, cash in hand and say nothing. There was a third party used to purchase the vehicle.
Car was purchased the night before Arlene went missing, and then it was disposed of.
And so that vehicle, the whereabouts of that vehicle, sightings of that vehicle, really re-energised the investigation, because we began to believe that the purchase of that vehicle was inextricably linked to her disappearance. And could that have been the vehicle that was enticed her out?
Police had a lead. They summed it up like this. A car had been bought by a Fraser confidant the day before Arlene had disappeared, and then it had been destroyed.
It's very, very strange. Why would you do that?
Other inexplicable evidence had been uncovered, like the mystery of the missing and then reappearing wedding rings.
The initial crime scene examination of the house within a day of Arlene gone missing, the house was sealed and it was looked at forensically, and including that forensic examination was a full video sweep of the house. Days after that, once the family had moved back into the home, one of the family members recovered from the bathroom 3 rings, Arlene's wedding ring, engagement ring and eternity ring. But they hadn't been there during the course of the video. Now bear in mind, Nat had had fairly regular and free access to the house at that point in time. So the belief was that the rings had been returned to the house by Nat.
He was crazy to think that the police hunting for this woman who's gone missing, and even her family, wouldn't notice that the rings weren't there and then they've suddenly appeared again. So that really suggests that somebody has gone in and planted those rings, and he's doing it to support his story that she's just run off and she was trying to leave him. But you know, if she was really trying to run off and leave him, surely she would have taken her rings and tried to sell them for money.
It seemed such an obvious mistake from Nat. Why would he not dispose of the rings? Why commit the cardinal error of returning to the scene of a crime, so further exposing himself to suspicion? Alan Smith put it down to Nat's greed.
As unbelievable as that might be, it is not that unbelievable if you understand how close Nat is to money and the value of these rings. And by reintroducing them into the family home was his way of being able to regain control of the rings and their value.
Yet another piece of evidence emerged to further draw suspicion on Nat Fraser. His story about Arlene walking out on the family with Nat's cash kept in the house. It simply wasn't true.
So his assertion was that Arlene had taken the money and disappeared, and it was all part of the plan, her plan. But what he was unaware of was that days before Arlene went missing, she'd humiliatingly had to borrow money from a friend for housekeeping. So she was low on cash. Now, if she had known there was a stash of cash in the house, she wouldn't have had to borrow from a friend. Never would have. So that didn't square. And even if that stash had been uncovered post-borrowing money, Arlene would not have gone missing without having repaid her friend the money. So that whole staged piece of theatre by Nat to again build on the fact she's gone missing and ran off and abandoned her family, when you actually looked in behind that was a mistake.
But there was still a big problem to overcome for police to prove that Nat was a killer. With so many sightings of Fraser miles away from Smith Street, home of Arlene, on the day that she went missing, how could Fraser be responsible? Police dug deeper into the part played in the mystery by a friend of Fraser, a man called Hector Dick.
So Hector Dick was a business partner.
It was Hector Dick who bought the now destroyed beige Ford Fiesta and may have helped dispose of Arlene's body.
Nat believed that if Arlene's body was never found, there could never be a conviction for murder. So his real driving force, I think, was in her body disposal, her body deposition.
In a rare twist at this point in their investigation, the year 2000, police had Nat Fraser exactly where they wanted him, in prison. Whilst the investigation into her disappearance and possible murder continued, Fraser had been tried for the assault of Arlene, for which he'd been arrested in 1998. Convicted, he was sentenced to 2 years in prison. During this time, a third person entered the police investigation, another friend of Nat Fraser, a man called Glenn Lucas. He visited Fraser inside prison. Neither men knew they were being filmed. There was no audio on the tape, so detectives turned to a deaf, identity-protected lip-reading expert to help uncover what had been said. Nat Fraser was doing most of the talking.
When he said something about if the bones are smaller than that, he actually held up his hand. If the bones are smaller than that, they cannot be identified by DNA.
The conversation between Fraser and his visitor Glenn Lucas seemed to confirm the prosecution case. Nat knew an awful lot more than he'd admitted.
And at another point, he actually mimed sawing his wrist when he was talking about cutting up the bones. And Lucas was saying, no, good idea. Police don't suspect you at all. And stuff like that. And telling him that he thought very much that Nat would get away with it.
Whilst they didn't deliver hard evidence that was able to be admissible in court, what it did do was give us significantly interesting intelligence.
And Nat was talking about how many alibis he'd had, how he'd been very sure that when he delivered, made the deliveries that everybody had seen him. I could tell they were talking about cutting up bones, but I didn't know whose bones. I didn't even know that someone was missing, let alone dead.
And that reinvigorated the investigation and gave us a number of lines of inquiry.
The information given by the lip reader did not offer new evidence, but it did confirm the case against Nat Fraser and his harrowing crime.
They were talking about a third party called Hackey, and how much Hackey had helped him. There was mention of a car and a mobile phone, and I don't know what or how he had Arlene killed, but there was a mention of a third party who had offered or agreed to hurt Arlene for a price.
By 2002, Alan Smith felt that he and the team had assembled enough to gain convictions related to the murder of Arlene Fraser against 3 men. Glenn Lucas was considered an accomplice to a conspiracy alongside Hector Dick, with Nat Fraser the orchestrator of the abduction and murder of Arlene Fraser.
We had no hard and fast silver bullet, no forensic DNA link between the victim and the perpetrator. We didn't have the luxury of that in this investigation.
Despite the absence of a piece of smoking gun evidence, Fraser, Hector Dick and Glenn Lucas were charged. What followed transformed Elgin from a delightful market town on the coast to the scene of complex legal arguments in court and the continued probing by police into what had happened to Arlene Fraser. Elgin and the picturesque Moray Firth became a temporary home to legal experts and senior detectives as prosecution and defence teams argued about, amongst other things, whether Nat Fraser and his alleged accomplices could ever get a fair trial in the small town. Eventually, it was decided to move the case to another town, Dingwall, 52 miles away. But 4 years after her disappearance, 3 men, including her husband, were due to stand trial for the murder of Arlene Fraser. The case was thought by some dangerously thin, but as the trial neared, one of Nat Fraser's friends turned against him.
He thought that he could confide in other people and that they would remain loyal to him. It didn't occur to him that they would not be loyal to him.
Hector Dick now offered to support the prosecution case, and he made an amazing revelation.
He claimed that Fraser had hired a hitman from down south, that Arlene had been abducted, killed, her body dismembered, and then her body was ground up and burned, and then her ashes were disposed of. He also claimed that Fraser had asked him to acquire a car to help with the abduction.
Charges against Hector Dick were dropped, as were those against Glenn Lucas. At last, Arlene's sister could have her day in court to put the record straight about Arlene. She was far from relaxed about it. Nothing was certain about the outcome.
Being a witness in a high court is very, very scary. You know, it's really scary.
Well, it was quite an experience because you're in the box, you're trying to answer these questions, and half the time my hearing aids weren't working. So it was a bit of a challenge.
It's just not a nice atmosphere at all. They have a way of doing things, and you're asked a question and it's a yes or no, and you come away feeling very frustrated because they've asked the question but you want to say but, you know, but no, it's a yes or no, so you feel kind of unfulfilled.
What would be the outcome? Had Nat Fraser made a killer's mistake? Would he be found guilty of the murder of Arlene Fraser? Carol Gillies and her father Hector attended on the verdict of the court in January 2003, just 3 months short of 5 years since Arlene had disappeared. Nat Fraser was found guilty. The judge offered his opinion of Arlene's killer.
The judge made it very clear that he felt that this was an evil crime. It was without any care for anybody else. It was planned, it was brutal, it involved other people. It even hurt, his own child. So when the judge described him as evil, that's quite a big step to take. That's almost saying there is no mitigation in what you did whatsoever.
But if the people of Elgin thought that it was case closed, they were wrong. Nat Fraser would appeal and his conviction would be quashed.
Well, today's the day we'll find out if police and prosecution have withheld evidence, if they're allowed to withhold evidence.
In 2008, after a series of court hearings both in Scotland and in London, on a legal technicality related to the Crown's evidence about the rings found in the Fraser family home.
There was a question, a technical question, in relation to the integrity of the chain of evidence and the way that those rings were handled by the police. And on the basis of that, the conviction was quashed because the rings played such a significant part in the first trial. And that was devastating. It was devastating for the police and the inquiry team, but it was doubly devastating for Arlene's family.
Oh, it was horrible. It was absolutely horrible.
And of course we were disappointed. We were bitterly disappointed.
The quashing of the conviction for the whole family was just devastating, absolutely devastating. The whole court process for each and every one of us it was just a living nightmare. It seemed so unfair to everybody involved.
Buoyed by his success in winning his appeal, Nat Fraser reverted to type.
The old Nat came back. It was as if everything had lifted and he was back to being the cheeky chappie on the high street in Elgin delivering his fruit and veg. He could not contain himself. And the family had to endure that. And it was hard, but he reverted to type. Nat reverted to type. And so that absolutely was all the motivation that was needed, if any was needed, to get this train back on the track. Let's get this investigation and redouble our efforts to get him back into court.
Police and prosecutors reconsidered their evidence. It may have seemed easier to let the investigation rest, but detectives wanted to take their case back to court.
And so he went on trial for a second time, and this, again, was the first time that an individual who had a conviction quashed was re-indicted and put on trial for murder for the same crime.
In 2012, Nat Fraser returned to court charged with the murder of his wife, Arlene. Would the case against him once again convince a jury? Had he made a mistake, or would the cheeky chappie win the day and walk free?
We always remember sitting in a room, we could hear them saying, jury verdict, court 3, jury verdict, court 3. And away up the stairs we went. I mean, our hearts were beating, absolutely beating.
She need not have worried. For a second time, a Scottish jury found Nat Fraser guilty.
It was just the relief. You try not to be, jump in the air. You try to stay composed, but the relief is unbelievable, just unbelievable, because the alternative was that you would just walk through the doors and it would have all been in vain. And, and Arlene would still be out there, and that seems so unfair.
Arlene's body remains undiscovered. It's somewhere out there, but the trial outcome did bring some consolation.
I don't suppose you could call it joy, but it was a relief, because we were down in London at the Supreme Court, and it didn't seem to be going too well for us. So I was a bit worried.
Nat Fraser was sentenced to life in prison for a second time. He will serve a minimum of 17 years. It had taken 14 years to bring him to justice. What was the key mistake which convinced a second jury to find him guilty? It was the crime scene itself which betrayed the truths Nat Fraser wanted to be kept hidden. If he was to be believed, the town of Elgin had been harbouring a selfish mother who had taken what money the family had and then set off on an extended holiday to Spain, having abandoned her children. But why would she leave behind vital medicine and her glasses? The unlikely claims by Fraser that a devoted mother would abandon her children, a wife who had already sought refuge from the abuses of her husband, did not ring true. Too many people knew too much about the nature of Arlene and that of Nat Fraser.
Nat Fraser thought he'd planned the perfect murder, but what he couldn't do is erase people's memories. He couldn't erase the things Arlene had told her solicitor and her friends about their relationship. The fact that he tried to kill her previously. They couldn't erase the fact that she was a wonderful mother and that she cared about her children. And when she didn't turn up to pick up her children from school, that rang alarm bells. That was out of character for her.
So that, for many, is the killer's mistake which Nat Fraser made, planning a story which asked people to believe that a doting mother and family woman would leave behind her children and, for what it's worth, vital medication too. It was that which convinced police, 2 juries, and her sister that Nat Fraser was guilty of murdering Arlene Fraser, a woman who nobody could believe would abandon her children.
She wouldn't do that to her family and her parents and her sister. She just wouldn't, because she knows us. She knows how we would, the grief, the worry. There's no way that she would put us through that. No way.
He excelled at sports, built for battle.
Jesse Matthew had the physical physique of a quintessential American football player. Large enough to be offered to play at the college level.
When his college football days were over, Jesse stayed strong, popular in his hometown of Charlottesville, Virginia.
He was from this community. He played football at our local high school. He helped coach football in one of our private schools in Charlottesville. He was frequently seen figure on our downtown pedestrian mall.
His first victim was 21-year-old student Morgan Harrington, abducted on a prestigious college campus. Eventually, Morgan would be found dead. 5 years later, Jesse Matthew snatched a second student, Hannah Graham, from the same university town.
We were against an apex predator who was comfortable abducting, raping, and murdering a girl.
Detectives gather evidence until a picture of a suspect emerges. Which piece of the jigsaw puzzle will reveal Jesse Matthew? What would be the killer's mistake?
It would have been really fun seeing how she turned out. I'm Morgan Harrington's mom. Morgan's not here anymore because she was abducted and murdered in 2009. Who would think our precious little Morgan would interface with a serial murderer in a nice town like Charlottesville, Virginia, and be taken down? But that is indeed what happened.
Charlottesville, a nice little college town. It was college towns that the serial murderer who had snatched Jill Harrington's daughter preferred when preying on his victims. In 2009, Morgan went to see one of her favorite bands at the John Paul Jones Arena on the campus at the University of Virginia, Metallica. Her father is Dr. Dan Harrington.
She had wanted to be at that concert for about 6 months before the concert occurred.
She went to go to the concert. I always have believed in leave-taking. I don't just sit on the couch and say, bye-bye. I get up and go see them out. And she got in her car and, put down her mirror, fixed her lipstick, and leaned out and said, 241, Mama.
241, a Harrington family saying.
241. I love you too much, forever, and once beyond forever.
Morgan, a student at Virginia Tech, 2 hours drive from the UVA campus, set off. She arrived to meet friends before heading to the concert. When inside, she had an accident. Witnesses would later describe to her family and friends what had happened.
We saw her fall on the way to the bathroom. You know, it's a concert and the lights are crazy, and she hit her head. So by the time she got to the bathroom, she was bleeding from an open gash. And she went outside in the cold, and she walked around for 45 minutes.
There's a rule at the John Paul Jones: no readmittance once you've left. Morgan was spotted, unsteady on her feet, outside the arena. As she began to feel stronger, Morgan messaged her friends, saying that she'd make it back to where she was staying in the student town.
So she called a cab company. When she was picked up in the cab, she's going to her destination, and she realizes that she doesn't have enough money for the fare. She almost has enough, but she just doesn't quite have the full fare.
The taxi driver is believed by several detectives to have offered Morgan a free ride home in exchange for some sort of sex act.
Morgan is so offended, she jumps out of the cab, wants to be so far away from this person that she literally leaves that cab running.
Morgan's friends returned from the concert expecting to see her, but she was not where they'd agreed to meet, and she wasn't returning their calls.
Morgan is quickly reported as missing.
The next day, a search of the campus turns up a troubling discovery.
And on October 18th, a lacrosse player found the ID about Morgan. On a bridge, on a walkway, something was wrong.
We got the call that Morgan's purse had been found outside John Paul Jones Arena. And I came in, Dan was sitting here, and we were waiting for her. He said, oh, you know, Charlottesville police called, they found Morgan's purse. And that was like the elevator plummeted, because you knew. If her purse was gone, she would have been on the phone crying. We would have heard from her. So I said, where is she?
Nobody knew in those early days that Morgan had tried to get a taxi ride home, so nobody suspected a cab driver in her disappearance, which was a mystery. She was officially designated missing. The Harringtons would have to wait 101 days for more news about Morgan.
Morgan Harrington has hundreds of waves to jump at the beach in the Outer Banks. Help us bring her back.
We brought in external people to search for Morgan. We had 2,000 people in Charlottesville who were searching for her.
How do you speak about someone who is missing? I don't even like the word. It's not descriptive. You know, my reading glasses are missing because I'm careless with them. We were not careless with our daughter. She was stolen from us.
The search in the weeks after Morgan disappeared was fruitless. Life got back to normal in Charlottesville. Nobody suspected 27-year-old Jesse Matthew, who was working as a cab driver in Charlottesville. He'd returned to his hometown after 5 years away. Morgan's life thus far had been one of middle-class surroundings, comfortable home. What of Jesse Matthew? He came from a devout Christian family in Charlottesville. His mother, concerned at his adolescent behavior, had moved him from the town to live nearby, but surrounded by Virginia farms, and not the temptations of drugs and crime in the city.
He lived in what's called the North Garden area of Charlottesville and maybe hunted on the farm.
It's important to remember that detail. Matthew knew the farms and fields which would one day be scoured for evidence of the missing Morgan Harrington. Once out of the town, young Jesse started to progress at school. Not academic, but big and successful at sports.
He went to high school in Charlottesville. He was an athlete.
Jesse came to understand himself purely in physical, in almost animalistic terms. He was this muscular, physically strong, dominant individual, and that's all he was.
If you lived in Charlottesville, Virginia, it was not easy to miss Jesse Matthew. Tim Longo would one day become chief of police in the city. He got to know all about Jesse, the talented American footballer. For the life that Jesse led, size really mattered. and his strength would become a focus of the later investigation.
Jesse was a massive figure. He was a large man, and I suspect in those days when he was engaged actively in athletics, I would suspect he was a very intimidating figure on the field, if you will.
In 2003, the intimidating football player got a place at university. He didn't last long.
He then went to Liberty University on a football scholarship. There was an accused rape there that no one prosecuted.
Inquiries are made about his relationship with this young lady. He says it's consensual, and he says that he didn't do anything, never forced anything on her, that this was somebody that he had a relationship and it was consensual on both sides. And then suddenly, Jesse Matthew is gone.
The 21-year-old Jesse Matthew had been a suspect, but was not charged. He was asked to leave instead. And the next term, Jesse discovers that there's always room at a college for another football player, and that there are more women to abuse.
He went to Christopher Newport. There was a rape there.
This is a man who's moving from college to college, committing a series of sexual assaults on women.
But this time, the campus, the college, it's all hush-hush. Nobody will talk.
And they're not being reported to the police. The colleges are handling them internally.
They all rely on privacy laws. They can't disclose the information for the sake and the privacy of the students that may or may not be involved.
When Jesse Matthew gets rewarded for his sporting prowess, for his physical prowess, I think that he would not have understood the difference between exploiting that prowess on the sports field and exploiting that prowess with women to attack and abuse women.
On both campuses, it appeared that one student had made a claim about another, Jesse Matthew, who had, in turn, claimed that acts of sex had been consensual. Matthew evades arrest. He is not DNA swabbed.
It's no longer a university problem. They're able to perhaps tell that the victim, the student, that the problem has been removed, and nothing gets done. There is no thorough, diligent police investigation into the assault of this young lady.
There's something about the pattern of offending, the persistence of it, and the intensity of it, which suggests to me that this activity is all-consuming for Jesse Matthew. It is who he is, it's who he becomes, it's what his life is about, the pursuit of this quest to satisfy his violent and sexual urges. That is all he is. He shapes his life to facilitate the activity. It fits in with the more important quest meaning to his life, which is the pursuit of these animalistic, predatory urges.
Jesse Matthew was a danger to women, but was not on the police records for rape, so he was still to yield his DNA to the US national database called CODIS. DNA is the detective's friend. With it, crimes can be more easily linked to an offender. Without it, rapists like Jesse Matthew can go undetected. He was yet to make the mistake of being arrested for a crime which required a DNA swab, so he was free to attack again. In 2005, Jesse Matthew had given up on being a student, but he was working in another university town, Fairfax City, Virginia. There are 6 college campuses within a 10-mile radius of Fairfax City. Matthew was a regular at university events, which allowed him to prey on undergraduates who assumed themselves safe, but who were not. Brian Harris was a homicide hunter for 20 years. He's been investigating the Jesse Matthew timeline.
In September 2005 in Fairfax City, there was yet another sexual assault victim.
It is as if he is a wild animal. All he knows, all he is aware of, all he is focused on are his urges.
But she was a survivor.
And the woman remembers enough to be able to generate an e-fit, so they are able to create a physical likeness of him. And he also leaves behind some DNA. The trouble is, DNA is pretty useless unless the person who's left the DNA has been swabbed and placed on the DNA database.
As his DNA was not on CODIS, the national database, no link could be made to Jesse Matthew. This was the e-fit image and was what detectives had to go on in search of the Fairfax City rapist. Jesse was upset when teased by friends that it looked a little like him. Eventually, they'd all laugh it off.
We have him getting upset at being recognised potentially in the photo fit. Upset. Now that's not the kind of emotional reaction that you would anticipate for somebody that was able to do the things that he did, for somebody who is so predatory, so obsessed with pursuing his sexual and violent urges.
He projected a public image of a playful, gentle giant. I guess there's no other way to describe it. He kind of had that image in people's minds, that he is not the kind of person, this kind of spirit that's capable of something this horrific. I think that's what people felt.
There are indications that this is not somebody out of touch with human emotion entirely. I mean, you just don't get people defending you if you are devoid of any human emotion. But the psychotic serial killers that we know don't get people standing up in their defense.
Opportunity after opportunity to arrest Jesse Matthew for sex crimes had come and gone over a 4-year period between 2002 and 2006. In 2007, he was back in Charlottesville working as a cab driver with a job on the side.
He played football in our local high school. He helped coach football in one of our private schools in Charlottesville. He was a frequently seen figure on our downtown pedestrian mall. He was well known.
The journey from schoolboy athlete to college footballer via 2 campuses before returning to Charlottesville was complete. As the search for Morgan Harrington continued in 2009, nobody knew about his sexual predator past and about the rape in Fairfax City. The evening that Morgan went missing, Jesse Matthew was just the gentle giant who was working the cab shift on the night of the concert at the main UVA campus when Metallica were in town. Detectives would not discover for a long time that Matthew was working the taxi rank nearby. There was something else they were yet to discover.
Morgan was looking for a ride. During the same time, Jesse Matthew has suddenly stopped taking cab calls. The cab company describes the night for Jesse as being extremely busy, constant call after call after call. But around 9:30, Jesse stopped answering. They couldn't get a hold of him. This is the exact same time that Morgan went missing.
That piece of evidence would remain unknown for another 6 years. How, after all, would investigators have uncovered it? They would need to request the records to want them. They would have to suspect Jesse Matthew. They didn't. No witnesses had seen him with Morgan. No security cameras had captured the moment that he picked her up in his cab. Three months after being reported missing, a farmer living not far from where Jesse's mum had moved the Matthew family years before broke the deadlock in the search for Morgan Harrington.
Morgan was missing for 101 days before her body was discovered.
It's hard to believe this, but having someone find the body is a blessing, because otherwise they are just forever lost. And so knowing that Morgan was murdered was far less concerning to me than not finding her body.
The body was actually a collection of bones. Clothing was also found. That was how police were confident it was Morgan Harrington.
What did show up was her t-shirt, which was a Pantera t-shirt that was very unique, that had blood on it.
And out of that blood, a DNA match, a DNA profile was developed, and that DNA match matched other cases in years past, other sexual assaults that had happened.
Specifically, the DNA matched that found on the victim of the Fairfax City rape. Detectives now knew that whoever had killed Morgan had raped the student in 2005. But again, without a cross-check on the CODIS database, the identity of the attacker remained unknown. A year passed, still no breakthrough. Metallica helped keep the publicity levels high in the hunt for Morgan's killer.
They called Dan 2 days after Morgan was abducted and said, as As fathers, we are outraged. How can we help you?
Hi, I'm James of Metallica. Back in 2010, our band offered $50,000 to help catch the person responsible for murdering Morgan Harrington. If you've seen the person in this sketch or have any information about this case, please contact your local police or submit your information online.
Despite the high profile of the crime, Jesse Matthew was still not a suspect. As the years passed, police and Jill Harrington knew that sexual predators who kill don't stop until they're caught.
I was told early in the investigation that it was most likely that Morgan's killer would be found from DNA on another body. During a press conference, I said, it's too late for Morgan, but please, let's work together and save the next girl. Because I knew we were against an apex predator who was comfortable abducting, raping, and murdering a girl, and I didn't want him to get another one.
An apex predator is defined as an animal with no superior in its natural habitat, the king of the jungle, unstoppable.
Jesse Matthews cannot conceive of not succeeding in this domain. He always has succeeded when he's applied himself physically. His understanding of women and of how to satisfy his sexual urges are such that the only route open to him is to continue, to persist, and to use force.
And I do feel that there is such a thing as a predator.
Predator is just probably the best characterization one could provide.
This person is in this town. He's a local boy. This is homegrown talent. He is comfortable here, and predators stay where they're comfortable.
Matthew, after Morgan's murder, did stay on in Charlottesville. Again, ironically, a year after she had been killed, Matthew was arrested. It would be another near miss in the search for Morgan's killer because he was not asked for his DNA.
In 2010, Jesse Matthew is arrested for criminal trespass. It's not an offense where a DNA sample is required. It's a misdemeanor offense. It's like getting a slap on the wrist. So who knows that day that he was arrested for criminal trespass, what Jesse Matthew, what his intent was.
Still without Matthew's DNA, there was no forensic evidence to link him to any of the sex crimes. And without witnesses to his attacks or images of him captured on security cameras when on the prowl, he was free to attack again, and that was what the predator planned. Early one morning in 2014, Charlottesville Chief of Police Tim Longo received a call.
I was in Texas teaching a class to a group of police officers, and I got up one morning and there was an email from a mother from Northern Virginia. And I'll paraphrase the email. It basically said, Chief Longo, help find my daughter's friend. I didn't know what she was talking about. I had just gotten to Texas. I wasn't aware of what had occurred over the weekend, so I quickly called home to find out that a 19-year-old University of Virginia student had come missing over the weekend. By the end of the day, I made a decision I needed to come home and meet two people that I would come to know, and John and Susan Graham.
The Graham family was British, working and studying in the United States, and their daughter Hannah was the young student who had gone missing.
This one particular night, she went out with her friends. She was celebrating. She had a few drinks. She went to one bar and another bar. At the same time, this very same night, Jesse Matthew, he is also out, and he is also bar hopping.
There's an ongoing debate about the use of security cameras in towns and cities. Charlottesville has few in public spaces, but it does have a lot of cameras in private spaces like stores on the downtown mall in Charlottesville. Jesse Matthews' night was about to be captured on camera. His well-known figure would register in the worlds of a lot of witnesses.
He went to at least 3 different bars. At each bar, every bartender, all the employees still remember Jesse Matthew. Why? He was a nuisance. He was hitting on women. He was making inappropriate comments and advances towards numerous women that they complained to the bartenders and the waitresses. Jesse Matthew, what was his reply? That he was out to pick up women.
A few streets away, Hannah Graham was figuring out how and where to meet up with friends.
Hannah Graham, unbeknownst to her, her path would cross with Jesse Matthew. Her friends had previously offered to give Hannah a ride. She didn't want to be a trouble to anyone, so she said she would walk. But Hannah was confused, she got lost, and even texted that she was disorientated and that she didn't know where she was.
She's 19 years old, bright, talented, but 19. You know, I worked very hard in the early stages of this investigation not to allow the image of this sweet young girl to be tarnished because of the decisions that she may have made that night, whether it be alcohol or something else. I don't think she deserved that. I don't think her family deserved that. And I worked very hard to make sure that we didn't paint that image. But the reality of it is, she is a 19-year-old girl. And she made her own decisions that night. And I'm not going to second guess those decisions.
She was somewhere around 14th Street. This is where it is believed Jesse Matthew picked her up.
Witnesses later said that they heard a woman scream, "No, I won't get in that car with you." Hannah never met up with her friends, did not appear the next morning.
So that began an investigation that day when I met John and Susan Graham that launched what would come to be the largest ground search in the history of the Commonwealth of Virginia. We spent many, many days, first in the city of Charlottesville, which is about 10 square miles.
Over 1,000 people were involved in the search for Hannah. They scoured numerous areas of town.
And then in concentric circles began moving outward into Albemarle County, which is our neighboring jurisdiction, some 700 square miles here.
The Beta Bridge is an iconic place at the University of Virginia. Students are encouraged to express themselves by writing on it. Volunteer groups use it as a place to issue rallying cries for helpers. Hannah had been part of one of those groups. At another bridge nearby, her family and those of Morgan Harrington would one day meet.
The anniversary of Morgan's death occurred during the time that Hannah was missing. And we had, as we did every year, had a memorial ceremony at the bridge, and we had media there, and the Grahams were there. The University of Virginia was also there.
As teams of detectives and volunteers searched the woods, fields and farms throughout the county beyond Charlottesville, Chief Longo and his team set about talking to witnesses, combing through what security footage they could find.
Thanks to some video surveillance footage that we discovered on our downtown pedestrian mall, where we believe that Hannah was abducted by Mr. Matthew, we were able to discern his image.
It was the turning point in the hunt for a killer.
All of a sudden they had pictures of Jesse Matthew, and it was interesting. Of course, at that time he had dreadlocks and a heavier beard. And one morning I looked at my Facebook, and this woman had messaged me, and she said, "I worked with Jesse Matthew, and here's a picture of him from 6 years ago." When you looked at the composites, and they were exact, I was stunned.
There is a lot of evidence which establishes that Matthew's victims fought for their lives.
While this is going on, Jesse Matthews shows up to work with a swollen jaw.
Witnesses tell police that actually Matthew has had a swollen jaw, which they think is a bit suspicious. He says it's toothache, but possibly it's a sign that his victim has hit him, and that's the cause of the swelling.
This causes people to reflect and think about, could this be the guy? No different than when you think back to Fairfax City and those original composite sketches, when Jesse Matthew, his own co-workers, looked at those composite sketches and would tease him, telling him, they look like you.
Suspicion of Jesse Matthew was building. The guy with the unmistakable physique was all too clearly walking along the Mall with the young woman who'd gone missing. Police now wanted to talk to Jesse Matthew.
The way we were able to develop sufficient probable cause to obtain an arrest warrant for him for abduction.
Once the warrant is obtained, when they go inside the apartment,
they also check his car. 2 vital DNA finds are made, including Hannah's on the passenger side of Matthew's vehicle, proof that she'd been with him, And then a second DNA find.
And they recover a pair of shorts, which they later find traces of his DNA and Hannah's as well, which is extremely incriminating. That swab they did on his car door, they also find Hannah's DNA, which places her in his car.
He doesn't even try to hide the shorts that have Hannah's DNA on it. Something that many killers would do, would be very aware of doing. But so primitive, so predatory is Jesse Matthew that he's not even aware of, he's not considering detection. He's simply focused, like an animal, on the pursuit of his immediate urges.
The shorts and other materials are dispatched for analysis.
They have a lot of incriminating evidence, but it needs to be processed. It has to go to a lab. But it takes over a week for those results to come back. In the meantime, the detectives have spoken to Jesse Matthew. He has not given his DNA. He has denied any kind of involvement.
We were not in a position to detain him at that time, so he was free to leave, and in fact, he did leave.
Matthew decides to get out of town quick.
And then he disappears. Just like he disappeared from his 2 football teams. He's gone and he's in the wind.
He, in fact, left the Commonwealth of Virginia. He made his way to Texas.
Had Jesse Matthew, the killer, made his biggest mistake? The ever-increasing use of surveillance cameras had put him in the frame for abducting Hannah Graham. What had he done with her? The seriousness of the allegations against him would mean officers could now obtain his DNA. Would that finally reveal his crimes? Whilst detectives awaited the return of forensic tests, he was on the run in Galveston, Texas. A month after being seen on the downtown Charlottesville Mall with Hannah Graham on the night that she went missing, the runaway Jesse Matthew was caught.
On a beach in Galveston, Texas, a woman saw his image, saw his face, and recognized him. And so she called the Galveston Sheriff's Office and she said, "I think I know this guy."
Matthew was arrested and soon, via video link, being processed for a return to Charlottesville.
Are you Jesse Matthew Jr.?
Yeah.
Mr. Matthew, my name is Judge Henry. You have 2 charges this morning. You have got a fugitive from justice warrant out of Virginia for abduction of a person with intent to defile. You have got a Galveston County charge of false information to a peace officer. Do you understand that?
Yeah.
Those who knew him, or of him, in his hometown, reacted with skepticism.
A lot of people in this community would have said to me early on in this investigation, "You have got the wrong guy. There's no way in the world that this guy could have committed this offense." He was well known, and there were people who just said, "You know, Chief, you're barking up the wrong tree."
On October 18th, 2014, in a wooded area rarely visited by anyone, and not far from where Jesse Matthews had lived after his move from downtown Charlottesville, the body of a young woman was discovered by one of the search teams.
It was about 10 miles out where we discovered the remains of Hannah Graham behind a house that actually had been for sale for some period of time.
When discovering both the bodies of Morgan and Hannah, detectives and analysts were struck by the unusual ferocity of the attacks.
The level of violence that Jesse inflicts on these young girls is horrifying, and it's extreme and excessive and unnecessary level of violence. Even in the most horrific of sexual and violent offences, we get some attempt by the offender to relate to the victim in some way or another, to even some acknowledgement of their humanity, but we're not getting that at all with Jesse. We're not even getting any acknowledgement of the possibility of being detected. He arrogantly is using the same MO.
There's fairly strong evidence to suggest that Morgan fought back. When her body finally was recovered, her bones, her skeleton revealed, her ribs had been broken, her arms had been fractured. It suggests that she was trying to fight back.
There doesn't seem to be any particular positioning of the body. His offences and everything that he does within the offences are simply expressions, are extreme expressions of his violent and sexual urges.
Detectives considered their evidence.
Jesse Matthew is in custody. He has charges, basically kidnapping against him. As each piece of that jigsaw puzzle is flipped over, We're getting that clear portrait, and the portrait is Jesse Matthew. But the investigation's not over. They know who they're looking at. They got to fill in those pieces.
Whilst he was in custody, detectives detailed their case.
He was very openly interested in Hannah Graham. That was clear by that video that depicted him walking one way and her walking another. And very quickly thereafter, the image of the two of them together. In the time that he spent with her, brief as it was, on the downtown mall, they were seen in a local bar and restaurant. He purchased 2 drinks, presumably one for himself and the other for Hannah. And then he was last seen leaving the mall in her company.
Having established he was the last person seen with Hannah, investigators now turned to the forensic evidence. First, the shorts found in his bedroom.
On those shorts was semen that belonged to Jesse Matthew.
Which means they can generate a full profile and match that DNA profile from Jesse Matthew, both to Morgan, to Hannah, and to that Fairfax rape all those years ago.
To say that it was a breakthrough in the Morgan Harrington investigation would be an understatement.
Those puzzle pieces that were flipped out on that table, they're flipping them over.
And certainly that forensic evidence not only connected Jesse Matthew to Hannah Graham's death, but to the death of Morgan Harrington and to the violent sexual assault of a woman in Fairfax City many years before.
They know that Matthew's DNA was on the shirt worn by Morgan Harrington.
And when they did eventually recover her shirts, they found some DNA on there, some blood, which possibly came from her assailant, and maybe it came from a scratch or from a bite or something. It suggests that she was fighting for her life.
Many years had passed since Morgan's disappearance and the discovery of her remains. And frankly, it was a mystery in our community and perhaps across this country as to who was responsible for the death of Morgan Harrington. And to be able to bring that case to closure was a milestone.
Would the killer's mistake of being captured on camera lead to his conviction? Virginia is one of 47 states in America which allows defendants to offer a so-called Alford plea. Matthew chose this route when facing charges in Fairfax City. He did not plead guilty, but would not contest the charges of rape against him.
I think the evidence against Jesse Matthew, had this case went to trial, was overwhelming. I gotta think that one of the reasons why he took the Alford plea that he did in Fairfax City was there came a point in that trial, I suspect that he realized that the government's evidence against him was more than sufficient for a fact finder to return a verdict of guilty.
Next came his appearance in court for the murder of Hannah Graham, seen on camera with Jesse Matthew.
They're flipping over each piece and they're getting a clearer picture. And who do they see? That jigsaw puzzle with all those pieces being flipped over is a portrait of Jesse Matthew.
The Hannah Graham case was just so clear that they had pictures of him with her, and so immediately it was a death penalty case. But Morgan's case, they had still not charged him with Morgan's death. And so finally, after several months, they charged Jesse with Morgan's death, and we went to an arraignment in Charlottesville.
Matthew again offered an Alford plea.
The big distinction between that plea of guilty in Fairfax City and his guilty plea here in the county of Albemarle was to hear Jesse Matthew say, when asked the question, and are you pleading guilty because you are in fact guilty, to hear him say yes, clearly admitting to the murder of these two women, was it was an incredible moment for their family and certainly for this community, to hear him accept responsibility for those horrific acts.
Jesse Matthew got 7 life sentences to be served consecutively, not concurrently. He yielded any chance for parole or geriatric release, any reason for early release, good behavior, or whatever that might mean, at a supermax prison. He's serving in the far corner of the state in a supermax. It's called Red Onion. It's a fairly notorious, isolated, hardcore prison. I'm told that he spends almost 24 hours a day in his cell, and that may remain the case.
In most investigations, a killer is revealed as having made a number of errors, but there's always one which proves pivotal as detectives piece together their case, which was Matthew's mistake. It was to give police enough of a chance to collect his DNA, which he had avoided doing throughout his predatory criminal career. He had escaped being charged after a campus sex attack in 2002 because there had not been enough evidence, and again in 2003.
And you know, in those early cases where he was sexually assaulting women, they weren't reported to the police, and so they weren't really investigated. And maybe that's why he thought, I can just do this. No one's reporting me. I can move on. I can offend again. He got greedy. But as his offences escalated and became more serious, so did the resources towards tracking him down. And he was leaving DNA each time. All it then took was for him to slip up, become a person of interest, for the police to take some of his DNA.
He essentially got away with attacking women. The endless advances that we know he made alongside these essentially endorsed, they reinforced the pattern of offending. This is somebody who already had an overinflated sense of self-importance, a sense of invincibility, and there he is, getting away time after time with these attacks on women. It was a dangerous precedent.
But he was not invincible. He made mistakes. All of the near misses from justice came home to roost because Matthew forgot the role played by cameras in modern towns and cities.
CCTV cameras capture her movements pretty much minute by minute. They also capture Jesse Matthew and place him with her.
It just made sense that video surveillance technology would be one of many ways in which to provide a safe environment for those who would come and enjoy downtown Charlottesville. And we had been making that plea to the local governing body for some years. And frankly, there was a lot of resistance, not just by the governing body, but there were some citizens that were resistant against the placement of video cameras, even in a public square. I think it became clear to many people in the aftermath of this terrible series of events how important such equipment could be. In no other case, the retrospective investigation of a criminal offense. It was a very, very critical piece in this investigation.
And it was one that almost certainly saved lives.
If Jesse Matthew hadn't been caught, he would have continued offending and the rate of offending would have increased. This is somebody who, this was his life, and every time he got away with it, it just reinforced his commitment and his belief in the rightness of what he was doing.
Jesse Matthews is a predator. I think predators are different stuff, but predators have to pass in the environment where the prey is, because that's what they do, is they hunt prey. If you look at the footage on the downtown mall when Jesse Matthews saw Hannah Graham, in 3 strides, he went from Fat Albert to Cheetah, because he had to assume the guise of Fat Albert and, you know, just a big gentle giant. But given the chance, he reverted to his real stuff.
Being spotted on camera with a girl who was reported missing began a train of events which has left Jesse Matthew in a cell for the rest of his life.
I've actually measured it out in my home, just how small a space he has. And for a man his size, he could take 2 1/4 steps. Large steps, but that's all. I think the walls are concrete. It must be miserable.
I say it's no different than if there was a rampaging bear in our neighborhood. People are not safe with the bear in the neighborhood. People are not safe with Jesse Matthews free and loose in the world. And he will never be that again.
Jack Taylor, 25, single, and a young man with plans.
Jack had a lot of confidence, and he knew what he wanted to do in life, and he went out there and done it.
After midnight, Jack left this club and decided to do something he may never have done before: make a date with a man.
Within 36 hours of this meeting, in the early hours of the morning, Jack Taylor was found dead.
We knew something had happened to Jack,
and we just didn't know where to start.
Jack had been murdered by Stephen Port.
Are you telling us the truth, Stephen?
I'm telling you the truth, yes.
He was lying. He'd already killed 4 times.
People started turning up dead.
It's just a sexual predator in every which way. Unfortunately, it resulted in the deaths of 4 men.
How to catch and convict the predator serial killer. As detectives piece together the evidence, they form a picture of a suspect. Which part of the puzzle will reveal Stephen Port? What would be the killer's mistake?
Stephen Port, I don't really like saying his name, to be completely honest with you. He's ruined our lives. He's ruined our family. He's took our Jack away.
Stephen Port would spend hours in a police interview room denying his crimes, refusing to accept that evidence of his online behaviour incriminated him in multiple murders.
No, just generally looking for general porn.
It had taken 18 months before Port was arrested in connection with the death of 4 men.
Were you involved in administering any drugs or poisons or noxious substances to him?
No, I don't administer drugs to anyone or give drugs to anyone.
At first, detectives refused to accept that there had even been murders, but the sisters of Port's 4th victim, Jack Taylor, would not accept that their brother had died of an overdose as the investigators had said. How could he have? Jack did not do drugs.
We asked the police about the syringe that was found on Jack, and it wasn't used. So you're telling us it wasn't used, but you're also telling us that he just sat there and injected himself and done an overdose.
Jack's was one of a series of bodies found in or near the ancient grounds of this church in Barking, northeast London. Like a string of other young men, he had spent time in the home of Stephen Port, a man who disguised himself as he trapped his victims.
We know that Stephen uses the dating apps available to the gay community extensively, but not just that. We know that he uses them with false identities.
Port rehearsed how he would kill, arranging a series of early hookups via the web. He would vary which sites he visited.
He is using another site called FitLads, and through that he meets a young Muslim man who'd never taken drugs or drunk alcohol in his entire life. The man is plied with poppers and says that he fell unconscious, and when he came round, Port gave him a drink, some clear liquid to drink, which he said was water, but he thought was perhaps something else. It again tasted slightly funny. Not only did the water taste a bit funny, but he felt a bit funny. He said he felt like he was partially paralysed, and he realised that his underwear had been removed. Now, he didn't want to involve the police or to report this to anybody because he didn't know what his family would make of revealing his sexuality, which he hadn't.
As bad as the experience had been, the young man was lucky to escape. He may well have been the last of Port's visitors to leave his flat alive.
Just 10 days after this encounter, Port books an escort on a site called Sleepy Boys, and he offers £800 for a young 23-year-old man to sleep with him for the night.
The man was called Anthony Walgate, a fashion student from Hull.
The appointment made with Walgate by Port was for the 17th, the night of the 17th of June 2014.
What would be his fate? Port described his version of events to Cody Lackey, an ex-con himself who befriended Port. In handwritten letters from his cell whilst awaiting trial, Stephen Port graphically told his pen pal of the role played by chem-sex drugs at his flat in Barking.
He took this guy back to his house. He was preparing drinks and stuff like that. He said that this person, the first victim, was administering his own dosage of the drug. And then he had a funny turn, as Stephen Port described it.
Port had met this guy for sex earlier that evening, had spiked him or convinced him to take a fatal dose of GHB, had sex with him, he'd become unconscious and died.
2 days later, on the 19th, Walgate is dead. Anthony Walgate's body is found propped up in a sitting position against the wall of the communal entrance of a block of flats in Barking. It's the block of flats where Stephen Port lives.
He dumped him outside his house and then phoned the police when he clearly wasn't responding.
Emergency ambulance, what's the address of the emergency?
Port, in his call to the emergency services, claimed to have simply come across the tragic scene.
Cook Street, there was a young boy, looked like he's collapsed outside, I don't know.
Stephen Port tells the police that he's found him there, that he's found this young man and he thinks he must have collapsed through drugs or through some other medical calamity.
Obviously shows the guilt of the man, because anyone with any modicum of humanity and stuff would have looked after that person and stayed with them. But the fact that he ran away was an admission of guilt in my eyes.
But not in the eyes of the police. Initially, Anthony Walgate's death was not considered a murder. It was a chem-sex-induced overdose, called in by a man who'd simply stumbled on the victim. But a week after making the 999 call, Port was arrested for lying.
What's the explanation for this young man suddenly being found dead outside this block of flats? They do a few inquiries around it, and those inquiries will include looking at Anthony Walgate's phone billing history and trying to find out what was he doing there, why was he in Barking at all. They realised through the Sleepy Boys website that he was in fact an escort, but not only that, he'd been booked for that night on the 17th of June by Stephen Port to come to those flats. Stephen Port, the very man who's phoned them up and alerted them and said, I've just found this young man outside my block of flats, apparently collapsed.
The belief that the death of a young man was a byproduct of consensual sex dictated an inquiry which was not searching for evidence of a killer's mistake.
How the police viewed the possibilities of Anthony Walgate's death would have dictated in which way they investigated it and to what depth some of the investigation went. If they were looking at it as an unexplained death, but not necessarily a homicide or a sex crime, then some of the sampling and some of the scientific work that would have been done around Anthony's body would be different to that in a full-blown murder investigation. So it's possible that that is where evidence that could have tied Stephen Port to Anthony Walgate might have been missed.
Indeed, inside Port's flat, there was a mass of evidence which might have incriminated him.
That should have been looked into more, especially when they knew that he'd lied and lied and lied. That would have been enough to look into it, and had they had done that, and had they had looked at his computer and everything else that we now know that they had everything, it wouldn't just be Jack's life that was saved.
We know he had searches on there for drug rape and drug porn, things like that. What was on his phone? How many other contacts might they have found? If they went through his account on Sleepy Boys and Grindr and Fit Lads and these other sites he was using.
Something else would have been uncovered. Port's video stash revealed much about his murder methods, his modus operandi.
We know that Stephen watched a lot of pornographic material where other men were being drugged and raped and abused while drugged.
None of that was uncovered by police after the death of Anthony Walgate.
It's hard to be too harsh on people who are doing their best, but you do have to ask the question as to why nobody thought that Stephen Port merited further and wider investigation at that point.
An internal police investigation would later ask the same question, but for now, Port remained unsuspected of murder, able and willing to kill again.
Stephen Port's second victim was a young gay man called Gabriel Cavari.
Gabriel Cavari was just 22 years old and he'd moved to London from Slovakia, and he started a sort of relationship with Port. He lived with him in the flat in Barking for a short period, and during that period Cavari was texting his friends and saying, "Stephen Port is not a nice guy."
Nice or not, Port was in a consensual relationship with the recently arrived Gabriel, a sexual one too. On August 28th, 70 days after the death of Anthony Walgate, Gabriel Cavari was discovered dead. His body left in exactly the same position as Anthony's in St. Margaret's Church graveyard, just a stone's throw from Port's flat.
He's got sunglasses on and his upper clothing has been pulled up to expose his midriff.
The sunglasses were kept by police, but not tested for DNA. Port had successfully gambled on Gabriel's death being written off as another overdose. He was growing in confidence.
You know, it's a secluded area, but actually it's very close to the centre of Barking. You know, just brazen, really, that he would, you know, obviously the first person he left outside his house, the second person he took here not a long distance and just sort of left him. You know, this is somebody who doesn't think he's going to get caught, or isn't thinking about it, or doesn't care.
Having lived a life without crime, now aged 39, armed with the means to attract young men to his flat and to spike his victims with drugs, rendering them defenseless, Stephen Port had killed twice in 3 months, and the killing hadn't stopped.
We get this slightly delayed initiation of his violent spree. But once it starts, he revels in the sense of power, of autonomy, which he hasn't had up to this point. It's not something which is intrinsic to his nature, and it's something which has been denied him by his rejection. So the sense of power must have been intoxicating once the series has started.
Port, the killer, had left a trail of evidence suggesting he was a murderer, but was suspected at this point only of lying in a 999 call.
Where was it that they were outside us?
Cook Street.
What door number?
I don't know, I didn't look.
You said 47 before.
Yeah, so what's 47?
The upshot of this is that Stephen Port is still free to carry on his activities. And those activities included, in just a few weeks, the murder of at least another 2 young men.
He had made mistakes, but which one would lead police to investigate Stephen Port? By August 2014, the bodies of Anthony Walgate and Gabriel Cavari had been found, apparently dead from a drugs overdose, in or near this secluded graveyard. What was going on?
So what you've got now is you've got 2 young gay men found inexplicably dead with their clothing pulled up within 500 yards of each other in the same part of London, and within a few weeks of each other.
And living just yards away from where the bodies are found, Stephen Port. Local journalist Ramsey Al-Wakil would one day investigate Stephen Port's behaviour as emergency services had arrived at the scenes.
So he must have seen the body, being found, and kind of, he left the guy in public, so clearly he's not that concerned about somebody coming across it. He's almost just sort of going, oh well, you know, on to the next one.
So did you have any involvement in the death of the male that we just spoke about a short while ago, Gabriel Cavari or Gabriel Klein?
No, I did not.
It was odd for us, certainly, for there to be two deaths in a short period of time. They were both men in their 20s or 30s. We asked the police, as I think you would, if there was anything to be worried about, basically, if the public were, you know, at risk.
The police said no. But on September 18th, 2014, just 31 days after the body of Gabriel Cavari had been found propped up against this wall, a third young man, Daniel Whitworth, was found dead.
You know, two deaths in sort of East London, it does happen, so I think we weren't sort of panicked at that point. When it really started looking odd for us was when the third man died, was found in the same churchyard.
Did you go with Daniel to meet people?
No, I knew he was doing the same as I was, but I'd seen him at the party and there was a brief conversation with him about it, but I've never actually engaged with him outside of the place.
Daniel Whitworth's body is found in the identical location to Gabriel Cavari. Same churchyard, the same wall, sitting up against the wall, clothing pulled up. Identical to the other bodies.
He was young, gay, and a user of dating sites. The similarities were remarkable, but a piece of evidence would emerge that would prove crucial later on.
So the difference being with Daniel Whitworth, he had a suicide note, or at least a note was found on his body in his left hand in the churchyard.
In the letter, Daniel confessed to being involved with the death of Gabriel Cavari, the second man found dead in the vicinity.
And in this note, he said that the reason he committed suicide was that he felt guilty about Gabriel, who had died while they were having sex, and he felt was on his conscience, that he had placed in the churchyard, and because he felt so bad about it, essentially, he was committing suicide in the same place, in the same way. And then just almost as a PS, he said, "Please don't blame the guy that I was with last night. It was nothing to do with him, it's all on me."
The letter was actually written by Stephen Port. If the police had suspected foul play as the cause of the three deaths, Port might have been a suspect. Detectives could have compared his handwriting with that on the note and seen that they were the same. But they did not. Instead, it was assumed to be a genuine suicide note.
From the police perspective, while it ought to have mattered, while they ought easily to have been able to prove that this was a false trail, it was wonderful news because they not only had an explanation for Daniel Whitworth's death, but his explanation for his own death was dealing with the murder of Gabriel Cavari. And at a stroke, there were two dead bodies that were effectively explained away.
Port had got away with murder using a schoolboy trick.
The suicide note is remarkable in its naivety and its childlike qualities.
But it worked. No DNA tests were carried out on the note.
Nobody really looked behind this note to try and see if it was genuine or not. And Daniel Whitworth's case went to a coroner for an inquest, and the coroner was quite particular in asking the police officers what they had done to try to establish the provenance of this suicide note. And I think it was slightly embarrassing, really, because they said, well, we haven't really done anything. It was just a note that we found on him, and we've taken it at face value.
Until further forensic and detective work was carried out on the letter, catching Stephen Port would not be possible, and it would be over a year before the letter was uncovered as a forgery. The prevailing theory seemed to be that Daniel Whitworth was the latest man found at a gay meeting site, the churchyard, who had overdosed on relaxant drugs like GHB. His was not the latest in a series of murders, because there had not been a series of murders in the estimation of the police at that stage. The press were told this was all a weird coincidence.
And I sort of thought, well, it's not that satisfying, but at least we've got an answer, which is, you know, carry on as you were, no need to avoid the graveyard. There's no serial killer on the loose, but it turns out there was a serial killer on the loose.
In March 2015, Port stood trial for the offence that he'd been accused of a year earlier, perverting the course of justice. He had claimed not to know victim number 1, Anthony Walgate, but detectives had later discovered that Anthony and Port had spent the night together before Walgate apparently overdosed from drug use. So Port had lied. He was sentenced to 8 months in prison. He spent 3 months inside, during which time bodies stopped turning up at St. Margaret's Churchyard or the roads nearby. It was in September 2015 that Jack Taylor was out with friends at the Dagenham Trades Hall Club. At 10:30, he's seen arriving at the hall, and at 12:30 he leaves. After departing from the Trades Hall, Jack calls a minicab, checks in on a dating app.
25-year-old Jack Taylor communicates with Stephen Port on Grindr, and it's 3 in the morning, but notwithstanding that, he goes over to Barking to meet him.
He heads for Cambridge Road in Barking after he and Stephen Port had agreed to meet. Nobody was yet investigating them, looking for them, but Port was leaving digital footprints.
One of the messages that they exchanged on Grindr was Port asking Taylor if he'd ever taken tea, by which Taylor assumed him to mean crystal meth, and he said, "No, I never have done, mate."
The dating apps allow people to pick partners. He has just used that to pick victims.
Shortly after 3, Port is recorded on security cameras near Cambridge Road in Barking Town Centre.
Port collects him at the railway station, meets him there, and they go back to Port's flat.
Port travels back to Cambridge Road and again is captured on camera, this time with Jack Taylor. Jack could not possibly have known how much danger he was in.
Within 36 hours of this meeting, in the early hours of the morning, Jack Taylor was found dead.
So we got a police appeal through for what we now know was Jack Taylor, Port's 4th victim. Body he was found in Barking. Not that different situation from the first 3 deaths. And I thought, you know, that's like what happened last year, you know, that's a bit odd.
Still unsuspected of being a killer, Stephen Port has claimed victim number 4. Will he be stopped before another young man is drugged and killed? What would it take to uncover the killer's mistake? For Stephen Port to be arrested for murder, police had to suspect him of involvement in the death of 4 young men, and in late 2015, they did not. Uncovering any mistake that would lead to his arrest and conviction would take a change of mind at the Metropolitan Police. Port's 4th victim and the determination of a family to get to the truth would become key to catching a killer. Jack, 25, was a forklift truck driver and very much loved by a family that lived just a few miles from Barking in Dagenham.
He was very passionate about family, always wanted to spend time with his family, his friends, loved socialising. Just loved being with his family and friends all the time. Just wanted to be a part of everything, didn't he?
Yeah.
It came as no surprise to his sisters that Jack had been out on that Friday the 13th of September.
Jack was very much the life and soul, and he would get on with everybody. He'd be really sociable. He was a really friendly person. Like, he was the sort of person, he walked in a room and he lit the room up. That was just the way he was.
Later that weekend, the news emerged. Jack has been found dead.
Might help if I show you a picture. We'll call this CRT. This is Jack Taylor. Do you recognise that, mate?
Taylor's body was found on the other side of the church wall at St Margaret's. He was propped up against the wall, sitting position, had his upper clothing pulled up to reveal his belly. Exactly the same as the other deaths in the area. In his pocket was found a syringe and a small glass medicine bottle. This was reported to local police as a suspicious or unexplained death. Police attended, and the conclusion they came to was that this death was probably self-inflicted by misuse of some sort of substances.
Not something the Taylor family were prepared to accept.
From what we were told, that there was something not right, we knew that because Jack didn't take drugs.
The Taylors became crucial to the eventual investigation into Stephen Port. There was a range of reasons why the sisters were sceptical about what they'd been told as they investigated what evidence they knew of.
We asked the police about the syringe that was found on Jack, and it wasn't used. So you're telling us it wasn't used, but you're also telling us that he just sat there and injected himself and done an overdose.
Another reason for their scepticism, the location where Jack was found.
And the fact that he was where he was when we were taken to the area, that's not somewhere Jack would ever be.
It just didn't add up. Their own internet research revealed how Jack was the fourth young man to have been found in the vicinity of the churchyard.
So we was trying to find out, like, if there was anything else that had happened around that area, anything similar. So as we started to go back, obviously that's when we came across the other boys.
With hindsight, how could it have been missed? Especially knowing that they were all gay, that they were all young, they'd all used the same drug, they'd all had sex. It just seems like, you know, links should have been drawn that weren't.
Stephen Port was going about his daily life throughout this time. He worked as a cook in a cafe in East London, and he was still dating via gay sites and apps. The Taylor sisters were yet to suspect him, but they were getting near to the truth.
It was just, well, it was heart-wrenching, and we always knew that we like basically had like a big puzzle. And as we were getting more and more information and we were putting it together, we didn't know what the middle bit was.
The local newspaper in Barking was equally sceptical. 4 gay young men found dead, each just yards from the home of a man who had reported the first death. The evidence that foul play was involved, to some, appeared clear.
When you think that there was so much linking these deaths to each other and to Stephen Port, you have to think, how smoking does a gun have to be?
Together, media and family turned to the police for explanations.
Jack Taylor's family, along with a local newspaper in Barking, kept up pressure on the Metropolitan Police to look again at Jack's death.
Other evidence struck the women. Until now, police had not suggested that the deaths of the men were linked. It was when researching the inquest into the death of Daniel Whitworth, Port's third victim in June 2015, that the remarkable similarity of the discoveries of the bodies struck the Taylors as evidence that the deaths were linked.
We then followed the coroner's report back then at what had come out, and basically it was nigh on the same as Jack.
The coroner into the death of Daniel Whitworth had also suggested more work should be done on the case. Momentum was building to look again at events surrounding the deaths near the St Margaret's graveyard.
And eventually their pressure had some sort of success in that somebody decided to get another officer who hadn't been involved before to have a look not only at Jack Taylor's deaths but at the 3 that had gone previously. And that officer was surprised, shocked by what was found, and made the suggestion that, do you know what, all these 4 deaths look like they're murders and they look like they're linked. And that was the point where the alarm is raised almost. The homicide team are involved, and all of a sudden the investigation that these offences probably should have had from the very beginning starts to take place.
Investigating officers now decided to track Jack Taylor's movements on the night before he died and checked his phone. They uncovered that he'd agreed to meet a man in Barking. They trawled through security camera images of the town. There he was. But who was he with?
And so there was a police appeal for a man who'd been with this dead guy hours before he died.
On the 13th of October 2015, the Met issued a CCTV image taken from Barking Station, which showed Jack Taylor walking with a tall, blonde man.
I think about 24 hours passed, and Stephen Port was arrested on suspicion of 4 murders.
It was now that detectives began a series of interviews with Stephen Port.
Don't recognise his face.
So you don't recognise his face?
I do not know, no.
The truth began to emerge. Taking the decision itself to consider the deaths as murder and Port as a suspect meant that any mistakes he had made might now be uncovered. The resultant publicity generated even more evidence.
After Port's arrest and charge, media coverage of the events brought forward a horde of people making allegations about Stephen Port. They included the young Muslim boy, and it was clear that Port had a settled method of what he liked to do and what he would do, and that was to contact men normally younger than him, normally considerably younger than him, on internet or apps, and get them to come to his flat, where he would ply them with a drug, with GHB predominantly, and then also inject them with something to render them unconscious, during which time he would rape them.
He has thought through every detail of how he is going to make this happen. And he has used all the tools of our time at his disposal.
Tools like the internet and dating apps. Officers discover that Stephen Port had cancelled his Grindr account just hours after the death of Jack Taylor. Why would he do that unless he was hiding something? They discover that he had used Grindr to contact Jack and others. The case against him was building. Whilst on remand, Port began his pen-pal friendship with the ex-con Cody Lackey. The handwritten letters, unknown about by police, were revealing.
Stephen told me in his letters that he met this guy on Grindr. He invited him round to his. They was both taking this drug, GHB, and he said that the guy knew what he was doing. He was administering his own amount of the drug. Then apparently took a funny turn. Stephen took him outside. I think he rang the emergency services.
Emergency ambulance. What's the address of the emergency?
Cook Street. There's a young boy who got his caps outside. I don't know.
Said that he found this body outside, but then he put the phone down when he was questioned by the operator from the emergency services.
The telephone number you're calling from. Hello?
They then rang him back. Stephen put the phone down again, and then when the ambulance and police turned up, he scarpered inside.
Port was revealing his version of events about Anthony Walgate. That's not all he gave away in the letters. He was candid about the effects of muscle relaxant drugs, and he seemed to know an awful lot.
He said you can't intentionally kill someone with GHB and stuff because the taste, they'd be able to taste it and stuff because it had quite a sour, like distinctive taste and stuff. But I think he was trying to convince himself more than he was trying to convince me and stuff.
The odd written relationship continued whilst Port was behind bars. In one letter, Port says that all of the men had died because they did not know the dangers of GHB. He even offered to give lectures about the subject when he was released. He said Port was not a killer. He was sticking to a line of defence that even some police officers had believed as the bodies turned up, that gay men were dying because of drugs overdoses, not because of murder.
He said he wanted to become an anti-drug advocate and stuff. He wanted to speak out at schools, colleges, universities, and in the media and stuff. He wanted to get himself a media profile, speaking out against drugs and stuff and the dangers of drugs and highlighting recreational drugs, if you will.
Through his pen pal, Port later perfected his defence. The young man had been inexperienced in how much drugs they should take. They'd overdosed and died. Port had not been responsible for their deaths, which had followed consensual sex. This was not going to be a straightforward case for detectives to gain a guilty verdict.
Might help if I show you a picture. We'll call this CRT 2. This is Jack Taylor. Do you recognise that man?
It was during the inquest into one of Port's victims, Daniel Whitworth, that the first breakthrough occurred. The coroner felt that the Daniel Whitworth suicide note lacked authenticity and should be subject to more forensic analysis. One section did not ring true. "Don't blame the man I was with last night."
They told us repeatedly that they had checked it, DNA checked it, sampled it, everything had been done, and that there was no reason for us to look into that. We was also told that all the deaths were not connected, which obviously is not true, because the suicide letter stated that Daniel had supposedly killed Gabrielle. So it was connected. We was told there was no connection.
The coroner thought the same. She returned an open verdict. An open verdict means the death was suspicious, but there was no clear cause. Would the relevance of the suicide note expose what really had happened around and in St. Margaret's churchyard? Were Stephen Port's mistakes about to be uncovered? The suicide note allegedly left by Daniel Whitworth, victim number 3, claims that Daniel had been with Gabriel Cavari, victim number 2, on the night that he had died.
In this note, he expressed not only his sorrow for committing suicide and upsetting his family and his friends by that, but saying that the trigger for it was the fact that Gabrielle had died.
The note also urged people not to blame the man who Daniel had been with the night before. Who was that man? Stephen Port.
The apparent suicide note. This was finally submitted to a handwriting expert. And the handwriting expert looked at other things written by Stephen Port, looked at other things written by Daniel Whitworth, and concluded that that suicide note was not written by Daniel Whitworth.
The handwriting matched exactly that of Stephen Port, and more evidence would emerge when other tests were carried out on the note.
And an expert made a statement to say that conclusively the paper that was used for the suicide note for Daniel Whitworth was the same as the paper on which Stephen Port had written his other letters. And crucially and clinchingly, Stephen Port's DNA was found on Daniel Whitworth's suicide note.
The sunglasses found by the body of another victim were tested for DNA. Sure enough, Port's was on them. Still, he protested his innocence.
I mean, Stephen, did you write this letter here, CRT 11?
No, I didn't.
The photos of it that's found with Daniel?
Yet more evidence. A blue sheet which had come from Port's bedroom and found over a victim's body.
Not only was Stephen Port's DNA found on the Daniel Whitworth alleged suicide note, but Whitworth was found wrapped in a blue sheet, or the blue sheet with him, and Stephen Port's DNA was also found on that sheet.
Are you telling us the truth, Stephen?
I'm telling you the truth, yes.
About the letter?
Yes.
It had taken forensic science to prove that the 4 deaths were linked and that Port had been with all of them, something he tried to cover up with a fake letter. It was the handwriting on that letter which was his undoing. When seen side by side with Cody Lackey's, which the police did not have available to them when investigating, the similarities are particularly pronounced on the letter P.
I mean, the fact is, yes, it's in theory, this was a wonderful plan. And if it had been properly executed and properly, he'd taken account of DNA and of handwriting comparisons and all the things that can be done with handwritten notes, if that was all dealt with, this was genius. This was, the stroke of a master criminal.
But Port was no master criminal. His other mistakes were exposed one by one.
Stephen Port's mobile phone was examined during the investigation, and it was found to contain no fewer than 83 separate video clips of pornographic material, many of which involved a man apparently having sex with another man who was unconscious. It was quite clear that this was something that represented Port's main sexual interest.
The evidence of his internet habits had revealed the full extent to Port's modus operandi. He would lure the men, often in an online disguise, to his flat, having met them via an app, and then spike their drinks with drugs.
Particularly within the gay community, relationships are formed through the use of the apps. It's a ready selection, rather than emerging organically. And really, if you think about it, what Stephen Port has done in selecting his victims is simply an extension of this. He's chosen his victims in the way that in the 21st century, people choose their partners, their relationships.
And then there was the discovery of CCTV linking Port with his fourth victim, Jack Taylor, which first exposed the serial killer to investigation.
And suddenly, that piece that we'd written a year before saying, "Don't worry guys, there isn't a serial killer on the loose," apparently just felt, you know, almost, there's a tragic irony to it because it was wrong.
In November 2016, Port was found guilty of the murder of 4 men. Writing this letter was the killer's mistake, which led to his conviction and a sentence which means he will join the small group of serial killers to have received a whole life sentence. Stephen Port will never be released.
It's just a sexual predator in every which way, and unfortunately it resulted in the deaths of 4 men.
I don't think you can put how much we miss him into words, to be honest. I don't think you can. Any of us. It's just, our worlds have just been squashed. He's a monster. That's all he is a monster. He had no value for life, and he didn't care what he did to boys and what he would do to people's families by what he's done. And being in prison is just too good for him, to be honest, because he's took people's lives and he's destroyed our families for the rest of our lives.
Every investigation is like a jigsaw, each piece offering new evidence as a picture of a suspect emerges. But which one will reveal the killer's mistake?
We can do it on the phone or?
Okay.
If a guy like Kent McGowen wants to kill you, he's going to kill you. He just managed to do it under the color of law.
I guess. This one?
911 County, what's your emergency? They are trying to break into my house, please!
So Kent McGowen, he was charming, he was likable, he was obsessed with being popular.
And who is Joseph Kent McGowen? Who are you?
Whom as a person? Well, an innocent man, that's for sure.
This was his chance at being that super cop that he always wanted.
Oh, please! What are they doing? They're just broken in, okay?
I said, drop the gun, drop the gun.
It looked like a clear case of self-defense. So to send Officer Kent McGowan to prison, investigators would have to uncover a killer's mistake. Old Oaks, Harris County, Houston. This road was the scene of a violent death. Homicide is not what you'd expect here. People are wealthy enough to pay for police cars to patrol the neighborhood.
This way you have a fully certified Texas peace officer with full arrest powers that can conduct traffic stops, arrest people, and has the full authority to truly protect you in that neighborhood. It's an excellent concept.
These are the guys driving around, providing a visible police presence, particularly in a very affluent suburb like Old Oaks.
Guys like Officer Kent McGowen. He sees himself as more than a patrol car policeman, issuing tickets and keeping an eye on big houses. He is someone who has spent his life dressing to be an authority. He has ambitions. He wants to be a celebrated detective.
We know Kent McGowen is a man who likes to wear a uniform. He was in the Air Force. When he leaves, he begins volunteering as a police officer.
It's not often that the Texas Correctional Facility authorities and the prisoners inside agree to a TV interview. Joseph Kent McGowen did. A career cop, this is not where he saw himself ending up.
To be honest with you, when I was a little boy, I despised bullies, thieves, and liars. I always had, as a little kid, had this issue with bad guys. And that just that was the trail which life led me. And that's why I went to the Air Force when I was 17, because that was about the youngest place you could be a policeman.
Officer McGowan's beat, Old Oaks, not the sort of area which will yield him the opportunity to excel, to be a hero cop.
He has the S on his chest as if he's Superman, the cop's cop.
Brian Harris spent decades as a top homicide detective in Texas. He knows how policing works and the level of experience that an officer is expected to have for each assignment.
He was assigned what's called a contract, his beat, basically. Very quiet. Not much police action is going to take place there, but he's assigned there until he gets enough time on and seniority where he can put in for another assignment, whether it's investigations or to a more crime-ridden area, but that's the area where he's there, patrolling. And there's not much crime that happens in that neighborhood.
So, little chance for Officer McGowan to make his name, until the events of a humid weekend in Houston take unexpected turns.
Deputy McGowan is patrolling this relatively quiet neighborhood, but at the same time, his ear is to the ground. He probably knows, okay, who are the little troublemakers, who are the ones that get in trouble, etc.
Officer McGowan pulls over a young man called Michael Schaefer.
And so he makes a traffic stop, and the kid is scared.
The patrol officer senses an opportunity to get himself an informer. If Michael can tell McGowan something useful, he'll let him go.
And he starts inquiring. I hear there's stolen guns going around.
Michael, nervous, anxious to avoid getting in trouble with the police, offers to help the officer. Kent McGowan now has his informant. Every good officer needs an informant on the streets, even in leafy Old Oaks.
So now you have Michael. He's just a kid, teenager, barely an adult in the laws of Texas.
But what can Michael tell Officer McGowan as an informer?
He feels pressured, so he turns to his friend. Hey, do you know where I can get a gun? And Jason gets him a gun.
Jason Aguilar, 17, is no stranger to trouble.
Jason's no angel. He's not a choir boy.
McGowan arrests Jason and hears a story which then escalates what had been an arrest for a traffic misdemeanor into something completely different.
Jason Aguilar told me when we were working, he said, hey, I can buy you a fully automatic laser-sighted Uzi for $3,000. And at the time, a bunch of automatic weapons were showing up in that area, some drive-bys and whatever. And he told me for $3,000, he could sell me a fully automatic for some guys he knows.
Officer McGowan's case is getting bigger. Jason is going to spend the night in a cell. Earlier, his mother, a lady called Susan White, had left this note. Call me if you need me. I love you. A mother's love was about to show itself. She heads to the police station.
When she comes over there, she goes, "I need to talk to my son," whatever. I said, "Hey, he's going to jail. He'll be able to call you in a few hours." She was clearly intoxicated.
Officer McGowen wasn't about to negotiate. It looked to him like Jason could be part of a gunrunner's ring, providing Houston's underworld with Uzis. It's an opportunity for recognition and potential promotion, and it had fallen right into Officer McGowen's lap.
What better way than to stand out to your supervisors, to stand out to the sheriff or whoever are your bosses, than to be this super cop, this great cop, or even to the neighbors and the people you serve in that community, to be the one that's crushing crime that they didn't even know existed in their neighborhood.
He tells his colleagues, "I've got evidence here of a gun cartel operating in this suburb. I'm going to crack it."
The day after Kent McGowen had arrested Jason, there was a further sinister development. He hears that Susan White had threatened Michael in phone calls between her and Michael's mother.
She starts saying, "Do you know Michael Schaefer? He's a snitch. Don't you know what happens to snitches? Don't you watch TV? In Houston, snitches get killed." Those are the exact words. She told me she's a freaking nut, is what she said. She's a nut. She's crazy. And then I said, "Do you think that she's capable of killing your son or having your son killed?" "Yes, I do." And I said, "We're going to go ahead and pick her up on a retaliation warrant." She said, "Good, get her off the street."
He interprets a general conversation as a specific threat, and then goes from people can get killed to you can get killed.
In McGowan's mind, he now felt certain that he should get an arrest warrant, and fast.
My name is Jim Mount. I was formerly employed as an assistant district attorney in Harris County, Texas, and I was one of the prosecutors who was involved in getting a warrant for Deputy McGowen. I prepared an affidavit in support of an arrest warrant for Susan White's arrest on a retaliation case. So he met me about 3 o'clock in the morning at a division of the DA's office called Intake, and he and I spoke, and based on what he told me, I prepared an affidavit that he swore to was true and correct.
A traffic misdemeanor had escalated to a crime involving gun running, and even, according to McGowan, an underworld threat of retaliation.
He was absolutely certain that Susan White presented a danger, an actual danger, to the informant that had been used to buy what he said was an Uzi submachine gun.
Officer McGowan had waited a long time for this moment. Taking down the head of a gun running ring which was flooding Houston with Uzi submachine guns. And who might be the leader of the gang? Someone superficially living the life of a homemaker in leafy old oaks. Susan White.
A sale of one single handgun suddenly becomes a big gun running, organized crime, mafia type scenario where the Don of the mafia is a middle-aged housewife.
Officer Kent McGowan was en route to the office of District Attorney Jim Mount. He wanted an arrest warrant for Susan White, who he said had threatened the life of her son's friend, Michael Schaefer, a snitch who'd caused son Jason to be picked up by police. Informants in Houston, she told Michael's mother, don't live long.
The initial district attorneys are going to say, yes, we will help you write this affidavit because this person is so dangerous. We cannot have people retaliating against our witnesses. We're not going to allow that to happen in Harris County.
He told me that Susan White was a person who was going to support her son and knew what he was doing. And so I guess in his mind, she was also part of this sale of this machine gun. He never told me in great detail about why he thought she was such a bad person. It was sort of conclusory. She's a bad person. You know, she's somebody that we got to get.
McGowen, a neighbourhood patrol officer, wanted to be in at the arrest of the possible gunrunner Susan White, a woman masquerading as Miss Middle America.
So I went in after midnight, I'm talking about everything done. I went in, it was after midnight, I spoke to Jim Mount, and he said, yeah, and by the time I got the paperwork and all that done, it was like 3:30 or 4 o'clock.
He was adamant that he wanted to arrest her himself. Again, that's not unusual, so that in and of itself didn't make me think something was wrong.
Because not only now does he have Jason, the gun runner, now he's going to go after the big boss, the leader of this big gun-running cartel that operates in an affluent neighborhood.
And I just told him, look, you can't get it done tonight. You can't get it done tonight. You're going to have to get it done later. And he seemed to be chafed about that. He was a little upset about that, and he said he was going to call his sergeant and they'd figure something out. But he was very, very clear that he was going to be the one to arrest her.
This is the arrest warrant Officer McGowen needed. He arranges for 2 deputy sheriffs to accompany him to Amber Forest Drive, Old Oaks, home of Susan White and her son Jason, who was fast asleep upstairs. It's after midnight, August 25th. On arrival, he calls her to ask Susan to surrender. She makes no reply to him. She's already on the phone. She's called 911 to complain about people outside her door.
911 County, what's your emergency?
Officer McGowen didn't know she was making the call.
And so I'm out there on the scene, we're knocking on the door for 15 minutes out there.
Who's there?
He, accompanied by 2 colleagues, prepares for so-called dynamic entry, breaking down the door.
I've always done dynamic entry, run a warrant to keep this from happening, keep somebody from flushing their drugs, grabbing a gun, hiding or whatever. But I figured being this wealthy lady in the neighborhood, I didn't know she was a nut.
At police headquarters, the 911 call continues. Susan White has been transferred.
Sheriff's Department. Go ahead, ma'am. My name is Susan White.
We have the transcript to clearly understand what Susan White said that night. She sounds confused. She was in a deep sleep when she heard men outside.
The door gets kicked in.
What are they doing? They're just looking, okay.
She's on the phone. She hangs up the phone.
McGowen and 2 other officers rush in. McGowen later says he sees Susan White with a gun.
I saw her go from right to left. So we had our weapons on, I look, and she's in the corner, she's holding the gun.
And he opens the bedroom door to be confronted by this woman who's holding a gun and pointing right at him.
Well, I came in, she had the gun at waist level, and she never said a word. Never. She said nothing. She had the gun at waist level, and it's true, I was tunnel vision, I see the gun pointing right at me.
This woman, Susan White, who he believes is the ringleader of a gun cartel, and she's pointing a gun straight at him.
She was standing like this in the corner. In the bedroom, the door was right here, and the door opened like this, and there was on chest of drawers, the TV and a converter box on it, if I recall. And
Show me what she looked like.
Huh?
Show me what she looked like.
She was standing with a gun just like this.
He fears his life is in danger and that his deputy's life is in danger.
Well, I saw her for maybe 3 seconds. I'm hollering at her 3 times, drop the gun, drop the gun.
She doesn't. She continues to point it at him.
I told her the second time, she kind of turned and pointed it right at me with the proverbial Mexican standoff. I'm about 11 feet away, I think it was. I told her a 3rd time. When she does that, she had it like this. She just squared at me, and she pulls the gun like this, and then put her finger on the trigger. And that's what I told her a 3rd time.
So he fires.
Believing his own life and that of his 2 deputies is in danger, Officer Kent McGowen fires 3 times at Susan White.
First round struck her in the chest, and she started to go like this. The second round was behind it and went through the arm and stuck right in the chest.
Another bullet hit her in the head. She was dead. Brian Harris has heard the recording of the incident picked up via the 911 call made by Susan White.
What you hear on the tape, you hear the entry being made.
How many is there? I don't know. Please? What are they doing? They're just looking. Okay.
He uses an old method of assessing how long it took to travel from banging down the door to the bedroom of Susan White. 6 seconds.
1001, 1002, 1003, 1004, 1005, 1006. Susan is dead. She's been shot. By who? Deputy McGowen. Now, Susan had 6 seconds to live from the point that the door got kicked in to the time that Deputy McGowen sees her in her bedroom.
He's a hero. He's cracked a big case. It's been his ambition for years to do this. He's been telling people, one day I'm gonna break a really big case, and here he is. He's shot the leader of a gun cartel. She's dead.
I did what I had to do to save my life, the life of Deputy Moronga Malloy at that moment. That's what I did.
As far as Kent McGowan's concerned, he's done his job. He's a hero. Case closed.
But McGowan had not told the whole truth. What was the killer's mistake, yet to be uncovered? Today, the murder rate in Houston stands at around 250 a year. In the early 90s, it was nearly double that. A North Side, South Side gangland feud accounted for many of that number. The death of Susan White, now a suspect in gun running who had allegedly aimed a pistol at an officer, was not immediately big news. Officer Kent McGowan had done what he had to do, no more.
Deputy McGowan, right after the shooting, is freely talking to other people about what he had to do, what he felt he had to do. He's creating this hero cop, how he saved his fellow deputies, how he saved his life, that it was this profile and courage of how he behaved, quote, under fire or potential of fire.
He goes back to the police office. He's very proud of what he's done. He's boasting about it even.
Officer McGowan's conscience was clear. Susan White had threatened to have one of his informants killed, an informant who had revealed that Susan's son Jason had sold him a gun, and according to Kent McGowan, Jason Aguilar had also revealed he could get an Uzi submachine gun for $3,000.
Yeah, that's what they were telling me, yes. I didn't know Susan White, so I didn't know if she's a nut or not. I'm going by what my informant said. I couldn't question him on a serious situation like that. I talked to Michael Schaefer a number of times that night, excuse me, and his mother, Jeannie Jakes. And they told me, yeah, that she's a nut. That kid was terrified. He was calling me 911, 911 the whole time.
But reading the statements given by colleagues, it's clear that the story does not add up. And Kent McGowan's post-shooting attitude was a concern too.
At first, his colleagues are like, yeah, you've done a good thing, but they're like, you've just killed someone and it's a woman. That's not a normal reaction to killing someone, even if they were the ringleader of a gun cartel.
That's a big red flag. As a homicide detective, and I've investigated numerous officer-involved shootings, from officers being killed to officers being involved in shootings, I have never, ever in 21 years had an officer that actually bragged about what they did. I have always seen officers that are fairly quiet. We make sure they get some counseling, some psychological counseling. It's a traumatic event. It's not natural for a human being to take another human being's life. Kent McGowan, his actions after the shooting, the things he said, huge red flag. What's wrong with this guy?
Some colleague officers reported another troubling detail of McGowan's post-incident behaviour. He had asked for the casings of the bullets that he'd fired when the autopsy was complete.
And then what he requests of the detectives, the trophy, he actually asks for the shell casings from his shooting scene so he can use them on display. Who would do such a thing? It's twisted. It's scary to think that you have a law enforcement officer that would be out on the street that would want to, almost as if it's a World War II ace where they put markings for every person they shot down. It's very disturbing as a fellow law enforcement officer that Kent McGowan would actually look at this as a trophy. the killing of a human being as a trophy.
Most murders involve killers who know their victims. More often than not, they're over relationship issues or money. As detectives evaluate evidence, they speak of breakthrough moments, the realization from one fact which emerges that a killer has made a mistake. From the moment that Kent McGowan began to brag about his exemplary behaviour in protecting his fellow officers from the dangerous Susan White, his version of events began to unravel. Susan White was on nobody's radar as a gun runner.
Apparently there's this big gun cartel in this affluent suburb of Houston. It's a woman. She seems like a regular mum.
Being that this neighborhood had little to no crime, most people would think is a great thing. But if you have a young officer that is trying to be this superhero, in their own mind, they can create a fantasy that's just not there. The kid at the corner street smoking a joint, that's a huge major drug trafficker attached to a cartel. Somebody is speeding, that's a possible stolen car for them. So they take what some would consider minor or non-violent offenses and they really blow it up. Now, if you take Kent McGowan's situation, you're talking about a sale of a gun, a handgun. And a sale of one single handgun suddenly becomes a big gun running, organized crime, mafia type scenario.
And then the reason McGowan had given for needing an arrest warrant began to crumble. Michael Schaefer's mother, Jeannie Jakes, 165 miles away in Austin, Texas, did confirm that the couple had spoken in general about the trouble that their sons had caused, and that Michael might be better served not becoming a police informant. But this was not a heated conversation between adversaries.
Jason's mom calls Michael's mom. No different than two kids who get in a fight in a schoolyard and parents are going to talk to each other. I take it as a conversation in generalities, not a specific threat. So you have two grown women talking to each other, and Jason's mom reaches out and says, you know what? What is Michael crazy getting mixed up with this guy? I mean, you know, in the real world, people can get hurt. People have even died from doing stuff like that.
If Deputy McGowan had simply told me that Susan White made a phone call to someone in another city and said, informants in Houston don't live long, that by itself would have been completely insufficient for me to draft a warrant for him. No judge would have signed it, no prosecutor would have accepted a charge against her.
As for the suggestion that Uzi submachine guns were part of that night's story, it simply wasn't true. As Kent McGowan gave evidence to investigators, replaying events for them to assess what had happened, something else emerged. McGowan knew Susan White before that night's events, and she knew him well enough to be frightened that he was outside the door.
So you can, but get McGowan away from my house. Get McGowan away from my house. I want him out of my yard, off my property.
A transcript was prepared of what Susan White had said, and soon it was confirmed she and McGowan had history.
I filed several complaints and I need some help immediately.
Susan White says she first encountered Kent McGowan because he kept pulling her over for speeding tickets. She says what he was really doing was hitting on her.
Perhaps McGowan felt that sort of behaviour was a perk of wearing the uniform.
Kent McGowan is somebody that isn't going to sit real well with the term no. And so when he's out in that neighborhood, he's wearing that uniform. And there's a couple of things you need to remind yourself when you're a young cop. Are you really that good looking? Suddenly you're wearing that uniform, you have all kinds of ladies and people hitting on you. Go back in plain clothes, you're really probably not that good looking. And are you really that smart? People twice your age now are asking you advice. You haven't been on earth that long to be that wise, but that uniform brings a lot of that. But that also sometimes can give a false sense of confidence. And I believe Kent fell into that category. And he had this single, beautiful, good-looking lady. Certainly why would she spurn his advances? When she says no, that's maybe perhaps her way of flirting with him. So because Kent McGowen couldn't accept the word no, or didn't have enough common sense to see that she wasn't interested, he kept pursuing her and pursuing her.
He pursued her often enough for her to mention her concerns to one of his senior officers and to urge the operator at the end of her 911 call that night to send help.
Who's there? Okay, do you need a deputy out to your house? They are trying to break into my house, please!
And she's scared. She believes this guy's going to kill her. He has made unlawful entry into her home.
What are they doing? They just broke in, okay.
All she knows in her head is Kent McGowen, and he's here to kill me.
Just days after the shooting of Susan White in an apparent justifiable act of self-defense, Kent McGowen had become a murder suspect. There were anomalies in his story. He had claimed the involvement of an Uzi submachine gun in his inquiries. Not true. To get an arrest warrant, he had claimed Susan White had suggested his informant might get killed. That claim appeared fanciful at best. And a big mistake made in his version of events. He had not told the district attorney that Susan White knew McGowen and had complained about him harassing her.
I filed several complaints and I need some help immediately.
McGowen denies that he knew Susan White, though he accepts she may have known him.
Well, you know what? Maybe she was stalking me. I've been asked that.
What was true? Was Officer Joseph Kent McGowen a hero cop or a killer in a uniform? And if so, what was the mistake that would uncover him? Who was Kent McGowen? Investigators wanted to know more about their 27-year-old colleague.
Kent McGowen, I would describe as a gypsy cop, somebody who was a narcissist, somebody who truly believes that they themselves are that superhero.
McGowen kept losing his jobs. The records uncovered show a checkered career rap sheet.
He gets a job as a police officer. Things don't go well in the police force. He's accused of sexual harassment. People say he has violent tendencies. He's a shirker. He's quite lazy, actually, even though he says he wants to be a hero. He's heard making comments about women, disparaging comments about women. He loses his job as a police officer. He then volunteers to be a police officer. He loses that volunteer position. He volunteers again. He's desperate to keep on wearing that uniform and to keep having the power that that uniform provides.
Kent McGowen has always refuted the claims made about him by officers who uncovered his career records. This is what he told us about the times he got fired, like when a complaint was made about him by a female officer.
See, that's not true. That's what happened. Do you want me to go ahead and explain?
Or when he was let go as a police volunteer after complaints from the public.
See, that's not true either.
So then you went to Precinct 4.
Right.
And you were fired there after 2 months.
See, that's not true either.
Complaint?
See, that's not true either.
So you're saying the investigations against you at Houston Police Department, not true?
No, there was some minor investigations. That was it. And when it was, I think, 3 of them.
As for the sexual harassment claims, it was not just Susan White who'd levelled complaints against him. It was a former colleague too. But McGowen maintains he was the victim.
It was some female officer who was stalking me back then, and she was crazy. I told her she needs to back off, and I talked to her after work.
There are already questions about his attitudes towards women. He's previously been accused of sexual harassment, and here he is shooting dead a woman who he has a history with.
Who detectives believed was clear. They took McGowan's plausibility and charm as a cover-up for the truth.
Some of the most violent killers I dealt with in 21 years of investigating homicides were charming, were so likable in that interview room. You wanted to like them, but I wasn't a fool. I knew that in a second they would kill me without even thinking twice. So Kent McGowen, he was charming, he was likable, he was obsessed with being popular, he was obsessed with being that super cop, and that's what made him so dangerous. He would do anything to portray himself as that superhero.
Character evaluations are one thing. If a jury was to convict Kent McGowen as a killer rather than believe he's a cop acting in self-defense, detectives needed more. They began to forensically analyze McGowan's portrayal of what went on during the 6 seconds from when he entered 3407 Amber Forest Drive and when he shot Susan White.
When I came in, she had the gun at waist level, and she never said a word. Never. She said nothing. She had the gun at waist level, and it's true, I was tunnel vision. I see the gun pointing right at me.
McGowan said in evidence that Susan White was standing by her bed, facing him, square on, and holding a gun in her right hand.
So I said, drop the gun, drop the gun.
She was facing you square on.
Yeah, well, at first she was, yeah, she was like this. She had like this pointed right at me. I said, drop the gun, drop the gun. And when I said the second time, she comes up and she points the gun. We're at the proverbial Mexican standoff, and I saw she had the weapon index, her finger was not on the trigger. Her finger was not on the trigger at that point. And that's what I was watching, the trigger. I knew if she touches the trigger, I'm gonna have to shoot her. I told her a third time, I see her put her finger on the trigger, and I hollered a third time, drop the gun. Well, I see her squeezing the trigger, and I fired 3 rounds, and she falls. But anyway, she falls face down, and then Morong went underneath me and jumped on top of her. Because we didn't know if she'd been hit or not. I mean, the room's full of smoke, the alarm's going off, and I'm going on the radio calling for a supervisor and an ambulance. Well, first thing, we run up to her, and she was on her right, on the left side, and the gun was still in her right hand.
The gun was still in Susan's right hand. There's a big problem for Officer McGowan at this point in his evidence.
Susan was a lefty. I venture to say that Kent McGowan didn't know that.
But Susan White was left-handed. Why would she be holding her gun in her right hand?
And if you're lefty, you're going to have, if you were to follow Deputy McGowan's story, you would have the gun in your primary hand. For the most part, you would have it in your left hand. When you look at the angle of the bullets, the wounds on her body, it doesn't match the scenario of somebody holding a gun in their right hand. So right there, when you do the physical autopsy on someone, that also is a roadmap of what happened. So an autopsy is done on Susan, and the angle of the bullet, the location of the wounds, they do not match whatsoever the scenario of Susan holding a gun in her right hand.
The angle of the bullet and the location of Susan White's injuries did not support McGowan's statements. If she was standing square onto McGowan, his shots should have entered her body in a direct, straight trajectory.
When she had the gun, when she was standing on, when I said, drop the gun, drop the gun. That's what I told her. She goes like this, and when she pulls it up, when she does that, she had it like this, just squared at me. And she pulls the gun like this, and then put her finger on the trigger, and that's what I told her a third time.
If you listen to Deputy McGowan, they have guns pointed at each other. It's a standoff. He had to fire before she fired first, and the guns were leveled right directly at each other. However, Susan's wounds on her body, the wounds going from right to left, that's an indication she's turning. Maybe hanging up the phone, turning, what? Or whatever's happening, but she's in a turning motion. And the way the angles of the wounds are, the way the angle of the bullet to her head is, that angle, that autopsy, that's a roadmap.
When they do the bullet analysis, what they find is that the bullets, there's strong evidence the bullets entered the side of her face and the side of her body. That's completely at odds with what McGowan is saying.
It is not consistent with the deputy's story that they were face to face, guns pointed directly at each other. You see, the wounds itself, that physical autopsy, totally disputes what Deputy McGowan states.
District Attorney Jim Mount was part of the system that issued the arrest warrant, so allowing McGowen the chance to shoot dead Susan White.
Now, what I believe happened is that I was giving him permission to go into her house and kill her.
He is now certain that he would have found a way to kill her, with or without the cover of a warrant. Nevertheless, that night would have been different if Officer McGowen had not had this crucial piece of paper.
Clearly, he wanted to be able to arrest her, to go into her house, have a legal basis to go into her house. And that's what I provided him, and what a judge provided him. That's why I say if a guy like Kent McGowen wants to kill you, he's going to kill you. He just managed to do it under the color of law.
He identified himself as police? Yeah. But I was in my bedroom sleeping, and there was somebody, they were looking through my window. They said, "This is the police." Who's breaking into your house? I don't know. They say they are detectives. I have been threatened by one of them. How many is there? I don't know. They please. What are they doing? They're just looking. Okay. Ma'am?
Kent McGowen was his own worst enemy. Loose lips sink ships. He wanted to be that super cop, so he brags about what he does. He perhaps fabricates in his own mind, creating this huge scenario of what took place in the shooting and the gun running, how he got this really bad person, and he's this super cop. The fact of the trophy bullets raised suspicion more than what an autopsy would do. So now you have an autopsy where the initial investigators are at the scene. They're observing his behavior. They hear about some of the comments he makes. Bells and whistles start going off. Now they look at the autopsy. They are comparing the trajectory of the bullets on Susan's body to the statement that Kent McGowen makes, which causes them to go back and look at the affidavit. Wait a minute. This affidavit says a whole bunch of stuff, and the scene is not telling us that. This is just a homeowner, perhaps with a gun in their own house like so many other Texans or Houstonians have. This is not some major gun runner.
As a prosecutor, when you have police officers come into your office in the middle of the night and tell you, hey, I need you to write me an arrest warrant for someone, you have to believe what they tell you. You have to take it as the truth. Otherwise, the system grinds to a halt. So, not knowing Deputy McGowen, I believed that he was going to tell me the truth, and I relied on what he told me. Turns out that it wasn't.
McGowen was found guilty by a Texas jury. An appeal based on a technicality was granted, but he was found guilty again.
But, you know, in retrospect, he got convicted twice. How can anyone think that he really is not guilty? I mean, seriously.
So what was the key turning point that led to the charges of murder levelled against Kent McGowen? What was the killer's mistake? For Brian Harris, it was not a what, but a who. Kent McGowen himself.
Kent McGowen's biggest mistake was thinking that he had the character and the ability to wear the badge on his chest. That man never should have been a law enforcement officer.
With 20/20 hindsight, it's pretty clear to me that this is a guy who probably should never have been a police officer, should never have been in a position to run an arrest warrant on someone who he apparently had a personal grudge against.
When you wear that badge, you represent, that's why it's called a shield. It's a shield to protect others. It's a shield of honor. It's a shield of integrity. It's a shield of service. You take an oath to lay your life down for others, to serve other people. Kent McGowen's oath was to himself. He wore that badge to serve himself, to glorify himself. His biggest mistake was thinking he truly could be a police officer.
He was a crook with a badge, is how I look at it.
Kent McGowen was not given a mandatory life sentence. He is due for release in 2022. he still maintains his version of events that night is true.
I've got to go.
I know you got to go, and I appreciate it.
Okay, thank you. Hey, I'm innocent. Donna wants the truth.
I'm
Just
not.
get the
I'm
truth.
not done. I'm still working.
I'm trusting you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Hey, how do you? We'll get this the mic back here.